Anime autopsy here, and I need you to sit down because I have spent an absolutely embarrassing amount of my adult life tracking every single promise in One Piece. Not the big three everyone posts on Twitter. All of them. Every vow, every I swear, every drunk declaration under a sakura tree. And listen to me. What I found genuinely bothered me, because in our heads, in the community mythos, One Piece is this perfect cathedral of foreshadowing where every promise is a sacred contract the author signed in blood back in chapter 1. We screenshot a panel from East Blue, put it next to a panel from Egghead, slap Oda planned this 25 years ago on top, and call it a day. This is normal. This is fine. Except here's the thing. When you actually categorize the promises, when you sort them into personal vows, inherited wills, and world-shaking declarations, a brutal pattern shows up. Most of them do not get kept. At least, not in the way the person who made them intended. Let's start with the straw hat, because that one is supposed to be simple, right? Luffy promises Shanks he'll become a great pirate and return the hat. Clean, iconic, the poster child for perfect planning. But we're 1,000+ chapters in. Shanks is out here cosplaying endgame raid boss, and that promise has mutated into something else entirely. Is Luffy actually on track to fulfill that vow, or has the story quietly turned it into a symbol he can never fully cash in without breaking the emotional economy of the series? Zoro and Kuina is even worse. 2 kids in a dojo swear one of them will become the world's greatest swordsman. Then she dies, off-screen, in the most aggressively mundane way possible, and that promise gets inherited, twisted, weaponized. Zoro isn't just chasing his dream, he's dragging a dead girl's unfinished sentence behind him. Is that promise kept when he wins, or is it fundamentally broken the second she never gets the chance to try? And Nami stands in front of Belmer's grave and promises to free Kokoyasi. She does. Heroic, cathartic, peak shonen. But after Arlong Park, the story keeps throwing islands at her. Oppressed towns, starving kids, nations under the heel of people way worse than Arlong. She cannot save all of them. The gap between what she promised emotionally and what she can do physically just keeps getting wider. The problem is that we as fans have lost the plot by treating every promise as a checklist item waiting for its epic payoff instead of what it actually is in Oda's writing, a narrative weapon. Promises are there to hurt you, to be delayed, broken, or handed off to someone who never agreed to them in the first place. By the end of this video, I want you to see that the most painful moments in One Piece aren't the deaths. They're the promises that die off-screen or come true in the worst possible way. So here's where we need to be honest with each other. This video is long. This video is 2 hours plus. Get a drink, grab a snack, tell your family you've gone to see Long. I need you to understand, you did not click on a chill top 10. You clicked on a man who opened a spreadsheet, typed promises in One Piece at the top, and then forgot to stop. Because I didn't just jot down the big ones you remember. I went arc by arc, chapter by chapter, SBS by SBS, hunting every explicit vow, every childhood dream, every government guarantee, every propaganda slogan. If someone in this story looked another character in the eye and said, "This will happen," it went in the document. If a newspaper or a world government mouthpiece promised peace, justice, that went in too. And then it got ugly. Here's the thing. The community talks about One Piece foreshadowing all the time, but almost nobody talks about Oda's promises as a system. We quote Luffy's, "I'll become Pirate King," Zoro's promise to Kuina, Nami's promise to buy back Kokoyasi, Usopp's promise to be a brave warrior, and we treat them as inspirational posters. This is fine. This is normal. But when you zoom out and actually count what's kept, what's broken, and what gets quietly inherited by someone else, a pattern shows up that most fans are completely misreading. My thesis is simple. One Piece is built on promises, but the real engine of the story is which promises are allowed to succeed, which are doomed, and which mutate into something new. The author is not just sprinkling dreams around for vibes. He's using them as an intentional structure, a planned hierarchy of whose words matter in this world. So method-wise, this is not a list video where I just say, remember that touching scene, and we all cry in HD. I built categories: personal vows, crew dreams, narrative oaths, inherited wills, and world-level promises. I tagged whether they're fulfilled on screen, fulfilled off screen, broken, delayed, or transferred to another character entirely. Then I started asking, what kind of promise does Oda actually let pay off? Listen to me, once you define those categories, you can start predicting which current promises are never getting fulfilled. Not in the pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast way, but in the this author has rules and he keeps obeying them way. Some of the most hyped vows in the fandom are structurally doomed, and that raises the stakes. Because if we can't even agree on what a kept promise is, then all the discourse about Luffy's final dream, the Will of D, and inherited wills in general is just noise. It's people yelling about payoffs without a definition of payoff. So before we touch Laugh Tale or Joy Boy, we need to nail down what it actually means in this story for a promise to live or die. Which means next, I'm going to show you the framework and the first promises it kills. So here's the uncomfortable part. When we say a promise is a promise in this community, we talk about it like Oda walked into a courtroom, raised his right hand and swore on the Shonen Jump logo that every I'll definitely is a binding legal contract. He didn't. He wrote dialogue. I need you to really sit with that. Zoro saying, I'll be the world's greatest swordsman. Nami saying she'll draw a map of the world. Luffy yelling, I'll become Pirate King. Those are not clauses in a treaty between author and fans. They're narrative devices. They're emotional explosives. The more sacred they sound, the more likely they are being wired for detonation. Here's the thing. In storytelling, a promise is not a guarantee. A promise is a loaded gun. You don't hang it on the wall so everyone can admire the craftsmanship. You hang it there so the audience spends 10 years wondering when it's going to go off, or misfire, or be picked up by the wrong person. The tension isn't, will they keep it? The tension is, how badly will it hurt when reality collides with it? Let me pull this out of One Piece for a second so you don't accuse me of agenda. Imagine a simple drama. 2 kids under a fireworks sky promise they'll grow up, get married, and never leave their hometown. Cut to 20 years later, one is stuck caring for a sick parent, the other moved overseas and never came back. They never marry, they barely speak. Is that bad writing? No. That broken promise is the point. It's the scar tissue the whole story is wrapped around. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is in fact how most grown-up narratives work. Kept promises are satisfying. Broken ones are haunting. And haunting sticks. Now, go back to One Piece with that in mind, and suddenly the series starts to look a lot meaner. Kuina and Zoro swear one of them will become the greatest swordsman. She dies on the stairs. That's Oda looking a 12-year-old dead in the eye and saying, your promise doesn't matter to the universe. Ace tells Luffy he'll never die. Then Marineford happens. That isn't a plot hole. That's a thesis statement. Even the world government is in on it. Their entire brand is a promise, order, safety, justice for the common people. And the story immediately shows you Ohara, shows you enslaved fishermen, shows you a celestial dragon shooting a civilian for sport. The world itself is lying to its own characters, and we cheerfully quote those lies as foreshadowing for happy endings. Listen to me. Oda is not just breaking promises. He's sorting them. Personal vows, inherited dreams, systemic propaganda, each category plays by different rules. Some are meant to be kept, some are meant to be passed on, some were never true for a single panel. And if you don't know which is which, you are trusting the wrong promises. So next, we need to build the actual framework. And the first thing it does is prove that one of the most famous promises in this story was dead on arrival. So here's the thing. Not every promise in One Piece is playing the same game. You feel that instinctively, but if we don't name the categories, the whole discussion turns into, wow, Oda really planned this versus, he forgot. That's useless. We need an actual framework. For this video, I'm going to sort every promise into 3 buckets: personal vows, narrative dreams, and systemic lies. That's the whole model. 3 boxes, and inside each box, promises obey different rules, serve different functions, and have different odds of ever being kept. Once you see what category you're dealing with, you stop treating every "I'll definitely come back" as if it's on the same level as "I'm going to find the One Piece." First category, personal vows. These are concrete situational lines in the sand. I'll come back. I'll protect you. I'll never lose again. They're time-bound, emotionally charged, and usually blurted out in the middle of trauma. Zoro's promise to Kuina, Nami telling Belmare she'll buy the village, Usopp swearing he'll never run away again, and then immediately stress-testing that statement. These are the promises that get broken, delayed, or twisted the most, because they're about the character's current self overreaching. The author is not promising you anything. The character. And Oda's very comfortable turning around and saying, yeah, that kid was wrong. This is not a sin. This is normal. Second category, narrative dreams. This is the big stuff. Zoro's world's greatest swordsman. Nami's map of the world. Sanji's all blue. Luffy's pirate king. These are not checklist items the story is casually going to tick off in chapter 700 and then move on. These are long-term narrative engines. They justify entire arcs, entire power-ups, entire emotional breakdowns. When Sanji cooks, when Nami draws charts, when Zoro trains, you're seeing foreshadowing of a potential future, but you're also seeing the author using that dream as a motor to keep the story moving. Whether the dream is fulfilled, subverted, or inherited is a finale question. The important thing right now is that these dreams are planned fixtures in the blueprint, not improv lines. Third category, systemic lies. This is where the world itself starts making promises. Government propaganda about justice. Celestial dragons promising protection to their territories. Pirate codes that swear we never abandon our own and then absolutely abandon their own. These promises are almost structurally designed to be broken because their job in the storytelling is to expose rot. When the world government says we'll keep the peace and then erases an island, that's not a plot hole. That's the point. So here's what I need you to do as we go forward. Every time we hit a promise, I'm going to tag it. Vow, dream, or lie. And then I'm going to score it. Kept, broken, twisted, or inherited. Kept is obvious. Broken is obvious. Twisted is technically fulfilled, but in the most cursed way possible. Inherited is when the promise quietly jumps hosts because the original speaker never had a chance. Listen to me. Once you start seeing those labels, some of the most iconic lines in this story stop being inspirational quotes and start reading as doomed from panel 1. And to prove that, we're going to start with a promise everybody treats as sacred. One of the earliest, most replayed scenes in the entire series. A little kid, a red-haired pirate, a straw hat, and a line that the community has been misunderstanding for 25 years. So here's the thing. When you zoom out from that straw hat promise and start sorting every vow in this story into neat little categories, you hit a wall. Kept, broken, delayed. Clean, satisfying spreadsheet approved. And then One Piece turns around and hits you with a fourth option that absolutely does not care about your tidy labels. Because some promises in this series are never kept by the person who makes them. They are structurally designed to be impossible. The promiser dies, fails, gets erased by history. And yet, somehow, the promise still comes true. Not through divine foreshadowing magic, but through other people picking up the pieces. We need to talk about inherited will as a resolution state, not just a theme on a poster. Inherited will, the way I'm using it here, is when a promise is kept by a successor instead of the original owner. The vow doesn't disappear when the character does. It migrates. Roger's dream of reaching the final island does not terminate at his execution. It jumps to a kid in a village bar, then to a generation of pirates who heard his words and decided for some reason that this was their problem now. Oden's dream of opening Wano is not fulfilled by Oden. It's carried very literally on Momonosuke's back and in the scars of the scabbards. Listen to me, that is not just emotional flavor text. That is a fourth category of outcome. Not kept, not broken, not pending, but transferred. And Oda keeps building structural machinery to prove it. The clearest macro example is the will of D. The entire world is terrified of a promise that nobody alive can quote. No one in the story can sit you down and say, here is the exact wording, here is the deadline, here are the terms and conditions. And yet, generations of D carriers keep stumbling into actions that move that invisible promise toward fulfillment. That is absurd. That is an author showing you a contract that outlived every signer and the ink is still binding. Now this absolutely wrecks our usual idea of a broken promise. If Kuina dies, but Zoro becomes the world's greatest swordsman anyway, whose promise was actually kept, on paper, she failed. On paper, the vow died at the bottom of the staircase. But in practice, Zoro spends the rest of his life treating her words as legally binding on his own soul. Did he keep his promise, or did he keep hers? And does the difference even matter in this storytelling system? This is where the community quietly panics. Because if a promise can be successfully completed by someone else, then your neat, did the character achieve their dream scoreboard is suddenly useless. This is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal for an author who has said repeatedly that inherited will is a core pillar. And I need you to hold on to that, because later on, I'm going to argue something that's going to make some fans furious. A few current Straw Hat dreams are not meant to be fulfilled by them personally. By design. On purpose, Oda has been telegraphing that handoff in advance. And when we line up the promises, you're going to see it. But before we break your favourite dream, we need to look at how often One Piece quietly lets promises die and never calls it a tragedy. So to make sense of all those quiet deaths, we need a tool. I need you to picture a really stupidly simple graph in your head, because this is the thing that's going to keep us honest when the hype panels start flying. Axis 1. What kind of promise are we dealing with? Not all vows are created equal. You've got personal vows, I will become the world's greatest swordsman. You've got dreams, the big identity level life missions, like I will find all blue, or I will draw a world map. And then you've got systemic promises, the stuff institutions say, the world governments, we protect peace, celestial dragons, we are gods, even Roger's my treasure is out there, go find it. Axis 2, what actually happens to that promise in the story? Kept, broken, twisted, inherited. 4 outcomes. That's the whole game. Here's the thing, when I say kept, I mean kept in a way that would hold up in court. Strict. No wiggle room. The original character fulfills the promise on screen in a way that matches the original intent and the original stakes. No, well, spiritually they kind of did it, copium, when Laboon finally reunites with Brook's crew and they actually sail together. That's a clean kept. If Sanji ever stands in a literal all blue, serves fish from every sea, and the story confirms it, that's a kept. Anything less goes in a different box. Broken is the easy one emotionally, but the community hates admitting it. A promise is broken when it clearly doesn't happen. The character dies first, or the story moves on and directly contradicts it. Kuina and Zoro's childhood vow, she dies, he can still honour the spirit, but that specific mutual promise is broken. A kingdom swears, we'll protect our people, and then sells them to slavers. Broken. No headcanon appeals. Twisted is where Oda lives, and where a lot of the foreshadowing magic hides. The promise is technically fulfilled, but in a way that undercuts the original emotional meaning. Zoro training under Mihawk while still aiming to surpass him is a textbook twisted vow. The path to keeping the promise temporarily violates it. If a character swears, "I'll never run from the enemy again," and then later runs strategically to save civilians, the author can stamp that as growth, but emotionally that promise has been bent out of shape. Inherited is the One Piece special. The original person never cashes the check. Someone else does. The core intent is fulfilled by another character or another generation, and suddenly that childhood dream is just one link in a chain. The Will of D is basically a giant category of inherited promises. Roger can't finish the story he started, so he throws the entire pirate era at the problem and waits for a kid with a straw hat to pick it up. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is the operating system. So from here on out, every time we hit an arc, we're dropping its promises into this matrix. Vow, dream, systemic on one side, kept, broken, twisted, inherited on the other. We need to do this because your brain, my brain, all of our little pattern-seeking monkey brains see Jesus in toast and call it peak foreshadowing. This grid is our receipts. It lets you see patterns instead of isolated hype moments. And once we start filling it in, a really uncomfortable picture emerges about which categories Oda almost never touches, and which ones he's been quietly stacking for the Final Saga. And that uncomfortable picture gets even worse when you zoom out from the page and remember this is all being produced by a human being on a weekly death march. Here's the thing. One Piece is not Oda in a cabin, sipping tea, leisurely arranging foreshadowing on an infinite canvas. It's 19 pages. Every week for 25 years. That means a hard page cap, brutal deadlines, and an editor whose job is literally to say, no, you cannot spend 3 chapters resolving the emotional arc of background villager number 17 who promised to start a bakery. I need you to actually imagine the spreadsheet. Hundreds of named characters, crew dreams, villain speeches, world government lies. Every "I swear I'll get stronger," every "I'll wait for you," every "I'll change this country." Now try to give all of those vows a clean on-panel resolution, while also minor detail finishing the main plot before your wrist disintegrates. That's not storytelling. That's a hostage situation. So when some early arc side character in Orange Town swears they'll turn their life around, that is not a blood contract. That's narrative texture. It's flavor. It sells you on the idea that this world is full of people with dreams, so Luffy's dream doesn't float in a vacuum. The promise is doing thematic work in the moment, not filing a ticket in a cosmic customer service queue that must be answered in chapter 1100. This is not a sin. This is normal. Pattern interrupt. If Oda actually tried to pay off every single background vow, One Piece would never end. Not, haha, it's long. I mean, mathematically never. You'd get One Piece, the side character years, where we pause the final war to check whether that one kid from Drum Island ever learned to ski. On top of that, this is a commercial machine. Reader surveys in Jump matter. Popularity rankings matter. If a character or subplot isn't polling, the editor is going to nudge Oda toward the stuff that does. That means some promises that may have been planned to matter more get quietly compressed, merged into another arc, or just evaporate. Not because the author forgot, but because the magazine is basically saying, we need to get to Marineford faster, or you're losing pages. Listen to me. Abandoning or warping a thread under that pressure is not bad writing. It's the cost of doing a 25-plus year epic in a weekly format. You prioritize the core, Straw Hat Dreams, the Void Sentry, the Will of D, Luffy's promise to Shanks. Peripheral vows become negotiable. Some get paid off in a sentence, some in a cover story, some never. And a huge chunk of the fandom's frustration comes from treating every on-panel vow as a legal document, instead of what it often is, a disposable tool in industrial scale storytelling, which sets up the real question we need to ask. How do you tell which promises were actually built to survive that meat grinder and which ones were always meant to die on the cutting room floor? So here's the thing. When we talk about One Piece pain, the community immediately sprints to the same screenshots. Mary's funeral, Ace in Luffy's arms, Oden in the oil. We make tier lists of deaths, we farm sad AMVs, we cry on schedule. But listen to me, the real emotional scam in this series isn't the deaths, it's the promises that never get to land. A death has a body, a broken promise is a ghost. It just hangs around the story, tapping on the glass every time the author brings that theme back. Ace saying, "I'll never die" to Luffy is a joke on the surface. Bravado in front of a kid. Then Marineford happens and that line mutates into a curse. He doesn't just die. He dies mid-promise, in the middle of "thank you for loving me." And the series quietly rewires that vow into Luffy's entire post-war existence. The problem isn't only that Ace is gone. The problem is that his never becomes Luffy's "I will never lose anyone again," which we all know is a promise the story is sharpening a knife for. Oden is the same category, but scaled up to a country. He promises to open Wano himself. The panels frame it as destiny, as if the author stamped a guarantee on it. And then Oda drops him in a pot and shoots him in the head. That promise doesn't get closure. It gets inherited. It leaks into Toki's prophecy, into Momonosuke's survival, into the Scabbard's obsession. Every time Wano is mentioned, you feel the absence of the man who was supposed to do it. The death scene ends. The promise scene never does. Kuina might be the cleanest example. She and Zoro promise one of them will become the world's greatest swordsman. She dies on stairs. Not a war, not a duel, stairs. The storytelling move is surgical. Oda cuts her off mid-promise and then has Zoro restate the exact same vow alone, sword raised to the heavens. The narrative literally picks the promise up off her grave and hands it to him. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, the intentional weaponization of inherited will. I need you to see the pattern here. Deaths in One Piece are often weirdly cathartic. There's a speech, a flashback, a clear emotional endpoint. You cry, you post your reaction, you move on. A broken or interrupted promise never gets that ritual. It just sits there, unresolved, so every future scene that brushes against it reopens the wound. That's why Oden's death hurts more over time than on first read. That's why Kuina's stair accident still haunts 1,000 chapters later. And Oda knows this. He is not a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. We are. He is the author who plans out which promises are structurally allowed to resolve and which ones are deliberately set up to be broken or inherited. The story keeps telling you that inherited will is the point. So of course he engineers situations where the original promiser has no chance in hell of cashing the check. This is fine. This is normal for long-form writing. But when you realize that a certain category of vow is built to fail, suddenly you start looking at current promises very differently. You start asking uncomfortable questions about straw hat dreams, about "I'll protect you" speeches, about oaths made under sakura trees and on burning ships. Because once we go arc by arc, I'm going to point at specific, current promises and show you why the structure of the story almost guarantees some of them are never getting paid off by the person who made them. And one of those is attached to a straw hat you are absolutely not emotionally prepared to lose, or worse, to watch fail. So listen to me, because this is where Oda scams you in the nicest possible way. East Blue is the tutorial, the cozy little sandbox where One Piece teaches you how promises are supposed to work. Clear, honest. You meet a kid, they shout their dream at the ocean, and you go, yeah, obviously that's happening. Luffy is the template. I'm going to be king of the pirates, straw hat on his head, Shanks' blood on the floor, and that hat vow feels surgically engineered to read as a guaranteed payoff. The author frames it as a personal vow plus a dream, with Shanks as the adult witness, who essentially notarizes it. From a promise matrix perspective, that's the cleanest category. Individual declaration, long-term dream, emotionally underlined as destined to be kept. You're not supposed to question it. You're supposed to lock it in as a fixed endpoint and then measure every other promise against that standard. Then you get Zoro. I'll become the world's greatest swordsman, shared with Kuina in that moonlit dojo. Same category, personal vow plus dream, again framed as obviously kept in the future. Except here's the thing, Oda immediately slips in the first crack. Kuina dies. Suddenly that promise mutates into inherited will. Zoro isn't just chasing his own ambition. He's dragging around someone else's unfinished goal. The structure quietly changes categories from I will do this to this must be done by someone. And the community just absorbs that shift as tragic flavor instead of a warning label. Nami's promise to free Kokoyasi is even more straightforward. She literally carves her arm, piles up 100 million berries, and swears to buy the village back. That's a concrete, near-term promise with a visible progress bar. The tension isn't, will this be kept? It's how badly would it hurt to get there? And because Luffy shows up and punches a Fishman warlord into the stratosphere, the story rewards you for trusting the promise at face value. Promise made, promise kept, catharsis achieved. Tutorial complete. Usopp is where the system starts bugging out. He runs around Syrup Village yelling, "Pirates are coming," when they aren't, until they are. His lies are proto-promises, statements of intent the world keeps accidentally honoring. Is he a brave warrior of the sea? Not yet. But the writing keeps staging scenarios where his fake declarations become retroactive truths. That's Oda quietly telling you that not every promise in this world is meant literally the moment it's spoken. Some are narrative IOUs the story may or may not cash in later. Sanji's all-blue dream is introduced as another clean, long-term vow. Personal dream, distant ocean, zero roadmap. The author plants it in the same category as Luffy's Pirate King promise. Obviously kept, just later. This is fine. This is normal. Early on, you don't even register the possibility that All Blue could be a Kuina-style inherited dream, or worse, a deliberate non-payoff. And that's the point. East Blue is intentionally idealistic about promises. It trains you to assume that heartfelt vows plus main character status equal guaranteed fulfillment. So when later arcs start twisting, delaying, or outright killing promises, it doesn't feel random. It feels like betrayal. The story taught you to trust, then weaponizes that trust. And the next C is where that weapon actually gets drawn. And the first time that weapon actually cuts you is a scene you think you understand perfectly. Kid Luffy on the dock, crying, bleeding, yelling that he'll become a great pirate and return the straw hat to Shanks. Pure, clean, a promise so straightforward you could write it on a kindergarten worksheet. When I grow up, I will give this hat back. No fine print, no asterisk. Just see you at the end of the story, old man. Except here's the thing. That scene is lying to you by omission. It's not just a personal vow. It's already part of an inheritance chain. We just don't know that yet. The community treats it as the promise of One Piece, the control group for promises that must be kept. But Oda is quietly doing tax fraud with the categories. Luffy thinks he's making a simple trade. I become a great pirate, you get your hat back. The author is making a much more dangerous trade. Roger, Shanks, Luffy. Fast forward to Marineford and suddenly Shanks isn't cool mentor who will show up for the hat handoff. He's a Yonko who can walk into the middle of a world war, stop it by existing, and negotiate with the fleet admiral. He's not just the guy who lost an arm for a kid. He's a political actor with his own agenda, his own secrets, and a direct line to the Pirate King's era. The straw hat stops being a souvenir and becomes evidence in a larger case. This is Roger's will, physically passed down. Once you see that, the keep the promise math explodes. Is Luffy really promising Shanks anything? Or is he unknowingly signing a contract with Roger's ghost? When Shanks puts that hat on Luffy's head, the foreshadowing isn't someday they'll hug and swap accessories. It's this child is the next carrier in a relay race he doesn't even know exists. I need you to hold that in your head the next time you see fans storyboard the final chapter as. Luffy hands the hat back. Roll credits. Because at this point, is returning the hat even the point? Or is the real promise, I will surpass you, fulfill Roger's will, and make this symbol obsolete? If Luffy becomes Pirate King, if he finds the One Piece, if he breaks the system that killed Roger and Ace, does he actually need to physically give the hat back for the promise to be kept? Or is that just our pattern-seeking monkey brain demanding a neat visual button so we can see Jesus in the straw hat? On our Little Promise Matrix, this started as a personal vow plus dream. Kid swears to his hero smiles, we all clap. But the more the story leans into inherited will, the more that original I'll return it looks intentionally unsatisfiable. Shanks is too big now. The hat is too loaded. We're trending toward an inherited will resolution, where the meaning of the hat matters more than the logistics of the handoff. And this is where the fandom faceplants. We need to talk about this. The obsession with the literal return scene assumes Oda is writing a clean, closed loop. He isn't. He's already twisted the promise into something ambiguous and possibly unkeepable on purpose. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, the whole experiment. What happens when the symbol outgrows the original vow? And if that can happen to the most iconic promise in the series, what do you think it means for all the others you're still waiting to cash in? So when I say the symbol can outgrow the vow, I'm not just talking about Luffy and Shanks. I need you to go back to the dojo in East Blue, to the most obvious inherited will tutorial Oda ever handed you, and you still walked past because swords were cool and you were 8. Zoro and Kuina, rival kids. 1,000 matches, 1,000 losses. He's this stubborn little brick wall who keeps challenging the prodigy girl who beats him every single time. Then you get that rooftop scene. Kuina admits her fear that, as she grows up, the world will never let her be the greatest swordsman. Zoro, offended on principle, throws down the only solution his tiny brain has access to. Fine, then one of us will do it. They make the promise. One of them will become the world's greatest swordsman. Here's the thing. Structurally, that promise is already rigged. It is a shared dream with a binary outcome. Only one person can be Mihawk. Only one person can stand at the top. The moment they phrase it as one of us, Kuina has mathematically accepted the possibility that she is not the fulfiller of her own vow. Then she dies. Brutally mundane. No duel, no blaze of glory, just stairs and gravity. The promise does not get broken. It gets reassigned. Her sword, her words, her frustration with the world, all explicitly transferred to Zoro. Oda doesn't hint at inherited will here. He writes it on a billboard. And then he complicates it on purpose. Because what does Zoro do? He sails out, gets his big East Blue hype, and the first time he runs into the actual endpoint of that promise, Dracula Mihawk, he gets turned into a shish kebab. He loses so decisively it's almost comedy. Then he does the most narratively perverse thing possible. He kneels. He begs the current goal to train him so he can one day surpass him. He is now collaborating with the obstacle. He's sharpening the wall he has to climb. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is Oda weaponizing humiliation as a step in promise keeping. So how do we classify this? Originally, it's a shared childhood dream, a mutual vow. After Kuina's death, it mutates into an inherited oath stapled onto Zoro's entire identity. And Oda is telegraphing that, barring some wild endgame twist, this one is probably going in the kept category, but only after a long chain of defeats, compromises, and working under the very man he swore to surpass. Keeping the promise requires strategically surrendering to it first. Listen to me. From East Blue onward, the author is teaching you a rule about this story's promises. The person who makes the vow is not always the person meant to fulfill it. Sometimes the promise is a relay baton, not a contract. And if that's true for Zoro and Kuina, the cleanest, most on-the-nose example, what does it say about all the unresolved declarations still dangling over the story? We need to start reading every "I'll definitely do X" with an extra question tagged on, or "Will someone else?" So when we ask, or "Will someone else?" we also need to ask a nastier version, or "Is this even the right promise?" And that's when Nami blows the doors off this whole conversation. Nami's deal is presented as the purest, most straightforward vow in early One Piece. As a kid, standing in Belmare's Tangerine Grove, she basically writes her life contract. She'll buy back Kokoyasi from Arlong, she'll free her village, she'll make Belmare's death mean something. One number, one goal. 100 million berries as this insanely concrete, life-defining target. The story sells you on the math. Hit the number, keep the promise, roll credits on her trauma. Then Arlong Park pays it off in the cleanest way possible, or at least it pretends to. Luffy wrecks Arlong, wrecks the map room, wrecks the whole economic logic of her enslavement. The tattoo gets covered, the villagers dance in the street. The Marines who were supposed to enforce the deal get punted into the horizon. On paper, this is a textbook kept promise ending. Goal met, vow fulfilled, character liberated. If you were a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast, you'd screenshot that panel and write a whole thread about how Oda always honors dreams. Except, here's the thing. The second Nami steps off that island, Oda starts quietly stress testing that promise. She sails into a world where Kokoyasi is not special. Everywhere she goes, there's another Kokoyasi, another Arlong, another Belmare who never got a Luffy. She runs into enslaved people in Sabaody, starving islands in the New World, entire kingdoms crushed under celestial taxes and pirate protection rackets. And she cannot possibly save all of them. So retroactively, her original vow starts to look very narrow. I'll free my home is heroic, but in a structurally unjust world, it's also local. It's a promise that fits snugly inside the borders of one village, while the rest of the map she used to draw is on fire. And the author is absolutely doing this on purpose. The same girl who once tried to redraw the world's seas for Arlong now has to confront the fact that her own dream map was too small. This does not mean her promise was bad. This is not a sin. This is normal for how personal vows work in a broken system. You fix your corner, you save your people, and then the camera zooms out and you realize the category of my responsibility just exploded. So I'd classify Nami's arc as a dream plus vow that is technically kept but thematically twisted. It foreshadows a pattern you're going to see over and over. Completed promises that are not actually the end of the conversation, just the first data point in a much uglier equation. And if a clean win like Kokoyasi is secretly compromised, what does that say about the really huge promises hanging over the entire world? So when you zoom out from Kokoyasi and you hit Baroque works, something really ugly clicks into place. It's not just individuals failing their promises anymore. It's an entire nation built on promises that are structurally impossible to keep. And Alabasta is the first time Oda grabs you by the collar and goes, "Hey, listen to me. This is what systemic betrayal looks like." On paper, Alabasta is a promise, a desert kingdom that somehow guaranteed stability, water, trade, continuity under the Nefertari line. That's the implicit social contract. You give the throne your obedience, they give you survival. Except when we arrive, that promise is already cracking. Years of drought, riots in Nanahona, a rebellion marching on the capital. The problem isn't that one guy forgot a vow. The problem is that an entire political system is collapsing under a conspiracy it cannot even see. Cobra embodies that. He never stands up and does a shonen fist to the sky speech, but his entire reign is an unspoken vow to protect his people. That's the systemic promise. The crown will keep you safe. And what does Oda do? He drops Crocodile into the middle of that drought as a walking counteroffer. Cobra's vague, paternal, trust me versus Crocodile's very explicit, very planned, I will save this country from its incompetent king. One is an inherited obligation, the other is a weaponized marketing pitch. This is where the foreshadowing gets nasty. Crocodile's fake salvation is the prototype for every world government, we're doing this for your own good speech you're going to hear later. He stages miracles, manufactures bandits, controls the dance powder narrative. The author is showing you a category of promise that was never meant to be kept. The systemic lie. It's not a broken vow, it's a con job running at national scale. And right in the middle, you have Vivi, a princess who infiltrates Baroque works, who spends years eating dirt and smiling for the crowd, because she makes one very simple, very personal vow. I will save Alabasta without sacrificing anyone. That is not a policy statement. That is a teenager trying to outpromise both a king and a warlord with sheer stubbornness. Here's the thing. If you sort these into our little taxonomy, it gets bleak fast. Cobra's promise is a systemic vow trending toward broken. Even when he's innocent, his people are still starving and bleeding in the streets. Crocodile's promise is a systemic lie, a category of promise that only exists to harvest hope. Vivi's vow is the one that is actually kept, and she keeps it by giving up her dream of sailing with the crew, by chaining herself to the very monarchy whose failures caused the crisis. And I need you to notice what that implies about Oda's writing. Institutions in One Piece almost never keep their promises on their own. When they do, it's because some individual, some Vivi, some random overachieving idealist bleeds themselves dry to drag the system across the finish line. This is not a sin. This is not bad storytelling. This is in fact how most of our real-world miracle reforms work. Which means Alabasta isn't just a self-contained victory. It's the author quietly warning you what it will actually cost to fix an entire world built on broken vows. And if that's the price tag for one desert kingdom, what happens when we scale that up to the world government itself? And if that's the price tag for one desert kingdom, what happens when we scale that up to the world government itself? Before we jump to Emu and nukes, I need you to zoom back to one very quiet, very human bill that already came due. Vivi's choice. Because Vivi is the first time Oda weaponizes a promise by not making it. You remember that farewell scene. The crew sailing away, the Marines watching, Vivi on the cliff screaming her heart out. She literally gives a speech about how she wants to sail with them, how she wants to be their friend forever, and then refuses to raise her arm because if she does, she's a criminal. The Straw Hats answer anyway, tattoos held high, and the community cries on cue. It feels like a recruitment. It plays like a recruitment. But the word join never actually crosses the finish line. Here's the thing. Vivi does make a promise there. It's just not the one we wanted. I will protect my country is a personal vow that outranks her implicit dream of freedom. She has the same fantasy Nami had, the same escape hatch you and I project onto every abused royal in this story, and she shuts it herself. Not because the author forgot, because the author intentionally shows you a desire that never graduates into a stated contract-level promise. That's a different category of writing. Most Straw Hats come in with a clean, declared dream. All blue, world map, cure every disease. You can put them on a spreadsheet. Vivi is a problem for the spreadsheet brain. She has all the narrative signals of a future crew member, all the foreshadowing of she fits, and then Oda cuts the wire right before it becomes binding. Listen to me. This is not a sin. This is not bad storytelling. This is Oda warning you that not every character who feels Straw Hat coded is going to get the Sunny Tour. Not every dream is allowed to be pursued. Sometimes duty walks in, slaps the shonen protagonist fantasy out of your hand, and tells you to go sit on the throne instead. And Vivi's vow isn't just personal, it's a personal plus systemic hybrid. She's promising as a girl who loves her friends, and as a monarch plugged into a world government that will absolutely execute her citizens if she sails off. That promise is being kept off screen, in committee meetings and famine policies, and probably very boring tax reforms. It's being kept at the cost of her personal happiness, and crucially at the cost of her narrative presence. The price of her promise is that she disappears from the story. We need to clock how early Oda does this, because it foreshadows a whole genre of later fandom pain. Yamato will sail. Carrot should be on the ship. The community debates these as if emotional vibes equal legal contracts. But Vivi is your first example that the author can stack all the hints, all the parallels, all the Straw Hat energy, and still never actually cash it out as a join promise. And once you accept that, you have to ask a much nastier question. If even the almost Straw Hats don't get their dreams, what does that say about the people who actually made theirs out loud? So here's the uncomfortable answer. A lot of them don't, or at least they don't in any way the world would recognize. And to see that, we need to go somewhere the world literally refuses to believe exists. Jaya and Skypiea are an entire 2-arc case study in a promised land that the majority of the community inside the story treats as a scam. The Sky Island is a meme, a punchline, a sailor's exaggeration. Bellamy calls dreams a joke. The bar laughs, the New Age says sit down and accept gravity. Meanwhile, Mont Blanc cricket is out there on the edge of the map, coughing up blood and diving for a city of gold everyone has already decided was a lie. That contrast is the point. Public mockery versus private vow. Cricket's promise isn't even his. It's inherited will in its purest, pettiest form. Nolan said there was a city of gold. The world branded him a fraud. Generations later, Cricket is still punching the ocean to clear a guy's Yelp review. And here's the thing. Structurally, that promise is impossible to fix. You cannot unexecute Noland. You cannot gather the entire planet, hold a press conference, and restore the Mont Blanc reputation meter to 100%. From the perspective of history, the problem is permanent. But emotionally, for Cricket, it's already kept. When the knock-up stream sends the going merry to Skypiea, when the Straw Hats literally walk on the Island of Lies, they validate Nolan's story in the only way that matters to him. He sees the Golden Bell's shadow, he hears that sound, and the author quietly flips the internal switch from fraud to fulfilled. The external world still thinks he's a joke. This is fine. This is normal. The promise only had to be true for the tiny group of people who actually touched it. And then you have Nolan's own promise to return to the Shandians. That's a straight-up broken vow. He says he'll come back, the king sabotages him, he dies on the execution platform branded a liar. End of story. Except, centuries later, Luffy rings the golden bell in the sky, sending that sound down to Jaya. He doesn't know he's finishing a sentence that started 400 years ago. But in terms of storytelling, he's the retrofit patch to an ancient promise. The author planned this as an inherited will payoff, technically kept functionally invisible. Pattern interrupt. Who is destiny for? Exactly. Is it for the people who live it, or the people who hear about it? Skypiea says those can be completely different categories. The promised land exists. The chosen hero shows up. The prophecy of the man with the straw hat and the voice of all things comes true in a very foreshadowing-coded way. But almost nobody on the blue sea ever finds out. The broader promise of history stays broken. Listen to me. This is Oda testing the whole idea of destiny under lab conditions. He builds what looks like a neat, chosen, one narrative, prophecy, ancient city, bell in the sky, and then buries it where the main plot barely cares. Destiny happens, but off-screen, off-record, off-algorithm. Fans treat Sky PA as a side story. The world inside One Piece does the same. So when the series later throws around promised lands and chosen ones on a global scale, Raftel, Laughtail, the One Piece itself, you should already be suspicious. The author has shown you that a promise can be real, planned, intentional, and still fail to resolve the way history or the audience expects, which raises an even uglier possibility we need to talk about. What if the biggest promises in this story are designed to be kept only for the people who are there, and permanently broken for everyone else? So when we hit Water 7, that ugly possibility stops being hypothetical and walks up to the crew with a baseball bat. Because this is the arc where the story looks at every cozy emotional promise we've been collecting and says, cool, let's see what survives contact with reality. Start with Usopp and the Going Merry. His entire identity is welded to that ship. He promises to protect her, to stand up for her, to be the guy who never lets her get thrown away. And the crew, by just existing as this found family, has an unspoken counter-promise. We stay together. We don't abandon our own. Robin's eventual "I want to live" is the loud version of that same vow. It's her finally saying out loud what the Straw Hats have been promising with their actions since East Blue. We are here, and we are not leaving you behind. Except here's the thing. Physics does not care about your feelings. The Merry's promise to sail with them forever is a fantasy, and Oda makes that brutally, intentionally clear. The keel is cracked, the hull is done. The shipwrights are basically doctors saying, if you keep pushing this body, you're killing it. To keep the promise to Merry, they would have to break the promise to each other. That's the problem. The category of vow where everyone lives forever on the same boat is structurally impossible in this world. So they give her a funeral. The author turns a broken vow into a ritual. The ship that could not keep sailing keeps one last promise under impossible conditions, and then they burn her. It's gorgeous. It's devastating. It's Oda telling you very calmly that some promises are only meaningful because they end. Usopp, meanwhile, does what a lot of fans would secretly do. He picks the symbol over the people. He splits from the crew, shatters that implicit unity. I'm not going with you. That is a direct violation of the Straw Hat's social contract. And when he crawls back, he doesn't get a clean reset. He has to apologize. He has to beg. The promise of "we'll always be together" becomes this warped, broken, then partially restored thing. It's technically kept, but there's scar tissue on it forever, and you can feel it every time the story brings up his insecurity. Robin is the inversion. She starts Water 7 clinging to a self-destructive promise. I will die alone. I will not burden anyone. I am a walking catastrophe and I refuse to drag you down with me. That is her vow to the world government, to her own trauma. And then Eni's lobby forces her to break it. I want to live is her saying, I am going to violate my own rule and rely on you. That broken promise literally saves her life. So if we're classifying Merry's vow is broken and sanctified, turned into a beautiful funeral, Usopp's unity is broken, then stapled back together, Robin's death wish promise is shattered on purpose. Listen to me. Oda is quietly teaching you that not all broken promises are failures in storytelling. This is not a sin. This is intentional design. Which raises a nastier question we need to sit with. If Water 7 is the rehearsal for breaking "I'll always be with you," what happens when the story finally points that logic at the endgame promises the entire community is banking on? So if Water 7 is the rehearsal, Thriller Bark is the first performance where the story stops playing nice. It takes that "not all broken promises are failures" idea and asks, okay, what happens when someone actually keeps the most brutal version of a promise? And the answer is Zoro on that lawn, standing in front of Kuma, cashing a check he wrote back in East Blue. Zoro's "nothing happened" is not just a cool moment the fandom puts on t-shirts. It is the Kuina vow, the Mihawk vow, and the implicit "I will get stronger for my captain" vow, all slammed into one horrifying transaction. He promises, without saying it out loud, Luffy's dream comes first, my life is collateral. And then the author forces him to prove it in the most literal, intentional way possible. Take every ounce of Luffy's suffering into your own body and say nothing. Listen to me, this is a kept promise, but it's a kept promise that escalates the stakes of every other vow in the story. Once Oda shows you that a Straw Hat will silently agree to die for Luffy's dream, every future "I'll protect you" line has a new, uglier flaw. The category here is important. This is not a broken promise. This is a fulfilled one that redefines what loyalty actually costs. Then, in the same arc, Oda drags back a promise from chapter 100 and twists the knife. Brook's promise to Laboon is one of the purest "we'll come back, wait for us" vows in the series, and the punchline is that they don't. They die. The crew is wiped out, Brook's soul is stuck on that ship for decades, and Laboon just keeps slamming his head into the red line, because he is taking that promise more seriously than the universe does. Here's the thing. This is inherited will in its rawest form. Brook doesn't just have a dream. He has a literal obligation to a whale who has been emotionally self-harming for 50 years. Fans treat the Brook-Laboon reunion as payoff foreshadowing. And yes, it was clearly planned, but structurally, it's an inherited, delayed promise that exposes a problem. Sometimes you cannot keep your vow on time, or even in your own lifetime, and the story shrugs and says, "This is fine, this is normal." Which sets you up for Sabaody, where the narrative finally goes, "Cool, now what if you can't keep the promise at all?" Up to that point, the crew has an implicit, smug little social contract. We'll always protect each other. We survived Eni's lobby. We survived a government assassination attempt. We are main characters. We are safe. And then Kuma walks in and speedruns the death of that illusion. The foreshadowing of Sabaody is psychological, not just plot. All those earlier wins create this false sense of security in you and in Luffy. If he just gets stronger, he can keep that unspoken promise to protect everyone, every time. Kuma's paw pads are the author's hand, physically slapping that belief out of the narrative. One by one, the crew is erased from the battlefield, and there is no counterplay, no clever tactic. No, actually Usopp had a plan. Luffy's breakdown there is not just "I lost." It is "I promised myself I would never let this happen, and the universe does not care." He's confronting the hard category shift from "I will always protect my friends" to "I literally cannot, no matter how much I grind stats." That is the story forcibly breaking a crew-level promise to justify the time skip and to reset our expectations about what future vows are even possible. So if you're tracking this structurally, you now have 3 data points. Zoro's vow, kept but weaponized to raise the ceiling on sacrifice. Brook's vow, inherited and catastrophically delayed. The Sabaody crew vow, shattered by external force on purpose to prove that raw willpower is not enough. And I need you to clock how all 3 are doing something very specific. They are quietly killing off the childish version of a promise before we ever get to the endgame oaths the entire community is obsessing over. Because the next move, obviously, is to ask, if the story is this ruthless with mid-game promises, what does that imply about the really sacred ones? Shanks' hat, Laugh Tale, the Will of D, when the bill finally comes due. So when you hit Marineford, that childish version of a promise doesn't just die metaphorically. It gets executed on a platform in front of the whole world with a camera crew. Remember where Ace's big promise actually starts. Not on the scaffold, in the woods, with 3 kids who are so traumatized by this world that their response is to swear they'll never die. That's not bravado. That's 3 abandoned children trying to invent a rule that makes the universe less cruel. If we promise hard enough, nothing bad can happen to us. It's magical thinking as self-defense, and the author frames it that way on purpose. Because once you put that vow in the text, "We'll never die," you've created a loaded gun that can only fire one direction. Here's the thing, a promise that absolute, in a story this obsessed with inherited will, is structurally a death flag. You cannot keep it without breaking the tone of the entire series. So the moment Oda lets you hear those kids say that, Ace's death stops being a twist and becomes a scheduled demolition. The story has to break it to prove how brutal this world really is. And Marineford is engineered, down to the panel, to be the most violent way to snap that childhood fantasy. The world government doesn't just kill Ace. They kill the idea that if we're strong enough, if we care enough, we're safe. The execution platform is Chekhov's promise. It's there so the community can watch it fail in real time. Then Oda doubles down by giving Luffy his own promise on top. I'll save Ace. At all costs, I need you to notice how intentionally he escalates that. Impel Down, the jailbreak, the war, the allies throwing their lives away, the miracle of the key, the chains breaking. Structurally, every beat screams this is the payoff, this is the foreshadowing coming due. And then, in the one moment where it should all cash out, Luffy fails to protect Ace from Akainu. Not because he didn't care enough, but because caring isn't a contract with the universe. That failure is the emotional core of everything that follows. Luffy's post-war breakdown, the silent panels, the I'm too weak realization, the 2-year training time skip, all of that is the hangover from a broken promise. We need to see a protagonist who kept winning on sheer will finally run into a vow he cannot keep, so that the next promises he makes feel dangerous. So what category does Ace's vow fall into? It's a personal promise, explicitly and definitively broken. He said he wouldn't die, he dies. Open and shut. But the emotional weight refuses to vanish because it gets inherited. Sabo's entire second life is built on not wasting Aces. Luffy's new promise is quieter and nastier. I won't be too weak to protect my friends again. The original text of the vow is gone. The subtext gets passed on. And listen to me. Marineford is the moment One Piece tells you, loudly, that not every promise you care about is going to survive. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is the author warning you that the ending will probably hurt in similar ways. You're not reading a wish fulfillment checklist where every childhood oath gets stamped approved. You're reading a story where some promises only matter because they fail. Pattern interrupt. What happens when the promise isn't about a single person at all, but about an era? Because once you see how Ace's tiny private vow gets shattered and repurposed, you're ready to look at the really dangerous category, the world-level promises that are too big for any one character to keep, and too heavy to simply break. So when Marineford ends, the story doesn't just hand you grief and roll credits, it hands you a new kind of promise. Luffy on that little island with Rayleigh isn't making some fluffy shonen declaration. He's staring at the corpse of his own naivety and saying, never again, never that helpless, never that out of his depth, never watching his friends die because he didn't do the homework. And Oda frames the entire time skip as that vow turned into a training montage. 2 years of off-screen grind is not subtle foreshadowing. It's the author screaming, the next era is going to hit harder, so I need you to understand why your protagonist doesn't just die instantly. Luffy's promise to become stronger is technically personal, but functionally, it's world level. Because if he fails, an entire era collapses with him. Which drops us straight into Fishman Island, the first post-skip test case for New Era promises. Here's the thing. This arc is infamous in the community for being mid. This is fine. This is normal. But if you only judge it on power scaling and gags, you miss that it's basically a museum of broken vows about equality. Queen Otohime stands on street corners begging her own people to sign a petition just to be treated as humans by the surface. That's not just a dream. That's a systemic promise. If we can prove our goodwill, the world will change. Fisher Tiger, meanwhile, breaks into Mariajois, frees slaves, and then refuses the world government's offer because signing their papers means signing away his freedom. That's a personal promise weaponized against the system. I will not legitimize the people who branded me. Both of them die. Their promises do not pay off in their lifetimes. The petition burns. The hero bleeds out on a ship, and yet the island clings to a new desperate category of vow. The Straw Hats will be our saviors. The prophecy around Luffy, the posters of the crew, the way everyone projects deliverance onto some goofy rubber guy who punches sharks. That's not character faith. That's a society outsourcing its broken promises to the next batch of protagonists. Then, Oda quietly pulls the rug with Joy Boy, an ancient apology carved into a poneglyph, and a broken promise to Noah, a literal arc meant to carry Fishman to the surface. Suddenly, Otohime, Tiger, and even Luffy are slotted into a pre-written script that's centuries old. Their individual vows are fragments of a decision the story already made in the Void Century. Inherited will is not abstract here. It's a backlog of IOUs the world keeps passing down because no one can pay in full. So we need to categorize this. Otohime and Tiger are systemic plus personal vows, aimed at changing institutions rooted in individual conviction, broken in practice but partially inherited by Shirahoshi's power and the Straw Hats' intervention. The problem is, they're still compromises. The island isn't on the surface. The racism isn't gone. The arc hasn't sailed. Listen to me. Fishman Island is the blueprint. It tells you the Final Saga's ancient promises. Joy Boy, the Will of D, the Promised Day of the world are not all getting clean, satisfying checkmarks. Some will be kept. Many will only be resolved through inherited will, partial victories, and ugly trade-offs. And if that sounds depressing, I need you to hold that thought, because the next set of promises we're about to look at are even bigger, and Oda has already shown us exactly how he intends to break them. And if that sounds depressing, good, sit in it for a second, because Punk Hazard and Dressrosa are where Oda stops hinting and just straight up shows you what a mangled promise looks like in practice. Trafalgar Law does not start as Luffy's quirky surgeon buddy. He starts as a walking revenge thesis. Kid with amber lead poisoning, city wiped off the map, branded a monster, then rescued by Corazon, the one Don Quixote who isn't a complete war crime in a feather coat. Corazon gives him a name, a future, a purpose, and then Doflamingo rips that away in front of him. Law's vow to kill Doflamingo isn't a casual shonen, I'll beat you someday. It's a terminal diagnosis stapled to a man's face. That is a personal promise in the purest category. And here's the thing. The author makes that very explicit. Law doesn't say, someone will stop Doflamingo. He says, essentially, I will end this man. It's targeted, it's intentional, it's framed by the story as the emotional payoff for everything Corazon did. If you're a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast, you look at that and go, cool, Chekhov's revenge gun. We know exactly who pulls the trigger. Except we don't. Because then Punk Hazard happens. Law walks into the plot with a very clean revenge through line and immediately contaminates it by shaking hands with the world's most weaponized golden retriever. The second he teams up with Luffy, I will kill Doflamingo, quietly mutates into we will take him down. Did you feel that? Ownership just got diluted. The promise is still there, but it's now running through a shared bank account. I need you to notice how deliberate that is. From that point on, every strategic beat is Law's. The Sad Factory, Caesar the Yonko destabilization plan. The writing keeps telling you this is Law's chessboard. But every emotional beat, every crowd-pleasing punch keeps drifting toward Luffy. Law sets the stage. The narrative keeps moving the spotlight. Cut to Dressrosa's climax. Law unloads his trauma, hits Gamma Knife, burns through his life to crack Doflamingo open. Mechanically, in a different story, that's the kill. That's the promise paid off. But Oda has already planned something else. Luffy needs a Gear 4 showcase. The community needs a face for the rebellion. The series needs its main character to plant the flag. So who delivers the final blow? Not the man who swore, the man who allied. So did Law keep his promise? Technically, yes. Doflamingo falls because of a chain of actions only Law could have initiated. Spiritually, emotionally, it feels stolen by narrative necessity. The promise is fulfilled by a tag team where one partner gets the catharsis and the other gets a flashback and some internal closure, which is exactly the pattern we need to track. This is not a sin. This is normal for long-form storytelling. Oda loves to let other characters finish someone else's promise. Luffy ringing the bell for Noland and Calgara. The Straw Hats freeing islands that side characters swore to save. In the moment, this is fine. It's hype. It's communal. It feeds the inherited will theme. But if you're actually scoring who fulfilled what, the categories blur fast. And if Law's revenge can be twisted, partially outsourced, and still count, what does that say about the really massive promises waiting in the endgame? So when you zoom in from world-shaking oaths to one blonde idiot in a suit, the categories get brutal. Because Sanji walks into the Grand Line carrying two of the most fairy tale promises in the story. Find the All Blue and never let a woman starve. Those aren't just goals. They're bedtime stories he told himself on a miserable ship in East Blue. The Chef Prince, the Magic Ocean, the gentleman who always feeds the princess. Clean, simple, child brain promises. Whole Cake Island is Oda taking that storybook, ripping out the pages, and showing you the binding. Listen to me. This arc is not random drama. It's the author dragging every promise around Sanji back to its origin point and asking, who actually kept what? The All Blue dream. Still open, still shimmering on the horizon, but the context around it gets poisoned, because now you see the kid who ran from a royal science project who was locked in a dungeon and told his existence was a mistake. Judge's promises to his children are the ugliest kind of foreshadowing. He promises greatness, a Gurma dynasty, a glorious future. In practice, that translates to abuse, eugenics, and erasing Sanji from the family portrait. The difference between stated promise and intentional plan could not be clearer. Judge never planned to protect Sanji. He planned to dispose of him. The promise was PR, even inside his own house. Contrast that with Zeph. Zeph doesn't stand there and monologue about fatherhood. He just quietly makes the most insane vow in the arc. I'll keep this kid alive, even if I starve. The leg, the shared starvation, the restaurant rule of never letting anyone go hungry, those are all physical receipts. Zeph's promise is kept through suffering, not speeches. And Sanji's chivalry vow to never let a woman starve, that's not quirky gag writing. That's a traumatized kid ritualizing the only kindness he ever received into a rule he can control. Then Whole Cake throws the fake happy ending at him. Forced engagement to pudding, arranged by the same father who locked him up. On paper, it's domestic bliss. A beautiful bride, a royal wedding, a seat back at the Vinsmoke table. In reality, it's a hostage contract. Sanji agrees, but it's consent at gunpoint. And to buy into that lie, he breaks a real promise. He walks away from the crew. He tells Luffy to leave. He kicks him in the face with the same legs Zeph sacrificed to save. Pattern interrupt. Who saves the promise scorecard here? It's not Sanji. It's Luffy. Luffy makes a counter promise, I'll wait here until you come back, and then actually does it nearly to death in the rain in front of Big Mom's territory, refusing food. That's Oda telling you which category matters. The fake marriage vow collapses. The Vinsmokes' systemic lies get exposed and literally walked away from. Sanji's vow to Zeph stays intact, even if it means bleeding for a captain who won't move. So by the end of Whole Cake, the ledger is clear. All Blue is still an open dream. Zeph's vow and Sanji's response are brutally, intentionally kept, and the royal promises are revealed as structurally empty. And we need to hold that pattern in our head. Because when the story scales back up to the world's biggest promises, Oda is going to run the same experiment on a global level. So Whole Cake cleans up the personal and exposes the fake royal. And then Oda says, cool, now let's do that experiment on a country. Enter Wano. Enter Kozuki Oden. Enter a promise so big, it literally has a void century attached as fine print. Oden doesn't just say, I'll be a good shogun. He vows to open Wano's borders and prepare the nation for Joy Boy's return. That's not a dad promising to come home from work. That is a world-shaking declaration stapled directly to the central mystery of the story. The ancient poneglyphs, the closed gates, the prophecy tied to a specific pirate messiah. This is an author telling you very intentionally this vow lives in the same category as the One Piece itself. And then Oda kills him. Here's the thing. Oden actually does the work. He sails with Whitebeard. He travels with Roger. He gets the Law DLC. He comes home with the answer sheet and spends 5 years humiliating himself, dancing in the streets to buy time to execute the plan. From a foreshadowing perspective, everything screams successful setup. The hero knows the truth. The clock is ticking. The borders will open. That's how this story is supposed to go, right? Except the pot boils, the people turn, Orochi and Kaido cheat, and Oden dies in a pot of oil while the scabbards fail to protect him. From Oden's POV, that promise is broken on the spot. He doesn't open anything. He doesn't see Joy Boy. The borders stay welded shut. The man who was most informed and most intentional about this vow is the one who gets the least payoff. That is not a plotting accident. That is a planned narrative cruelty. And then Oda hands the bill to an 8-year-old. Momonosuke inherits the title, the trauma, and crucially, the vow. He never asked to be the one who will guide the world to dawn. He just watched his parents die and got yeeted through time. Yet every adult in Wano, every scabbard, keeps repeating Oden's promise at him until it becomes his line. I need you to notice how messed up that is. The story takes a systemic, geopolitical objective, undo centuries of isolation, prepare for Joy Boy, and stuffs it into a terrified child who can barely transform into a dragon without crying. So where does that leave us in our little promise taxonomy? Oden's vow is both personal and systemic. It's his individual conviction as a man who saw Laugh Tale, and it's a structural project involving borders, history, and global balance. It is also, by design, broken in his lifetime. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is the author explicitly setting it up as inherited will, not personal closure. Wano is Oda grabbing the community by the shoulders and yelling, "Some of these promises are not for the people who made them. Stop expecting neat personal closure. You want Oden to open the country himself. Too bad. You want Momonosuke to get a childhood first. This is fine," the story says. This is normal for this world. And if Oda is willing to do that to Oden, the man who read the end of the book, what do you think he's willing to do to the rest of the promises still ticking away in the background? And here's the uncomfortable answer. A lot of them, he's willing to do nothing, because some of the promises you're mad at him for breaking only ever existed in your group chat. We need to talk about Yamato and Carrot. If you were anywhere near the community during Wano, you know exactly what I mean. Yamato shows up with the tragic backstory, the handcuffs, the Kaido baggage, the Oden obsession, the I've been waiting for you Luffy energy. Carrot has the Pedro inheritance, the rooftop panels, the sailing with you is fun beats. The discourse instantly hard launches into next Straw Hat confirmed. Not suggested. Confirmed. People were making crew calendars, power scaling Yamato's role between Jinbei and Zoro, assigning Carrot to lookout duty. The wedding seating chart was printed before the proposal. Here's the thing. The story never actually promised that. The fandom did. Somewhere around Whole Cake and Onigashima, the community built this unspoken rubric. If a character gets X amount of screen time, parallels a previous straw hat, cries on the sunny, and has a sad flashback. They must join. That's foreshadowing, right? That's intentional planned setup for a crew expansion. So when Oda doesn't follow the spreadsheet, people feel betrayed. He led us on. He backtracked. He broke the promise. Listen to me. That's not a broken narrative vow. That's a broken headcanon. Look at what the text actually promises. Yamato's explicit vow is not "I will sail with Luffy." It's "I will carry on Oden's will." Initially, that maps neatly onto joining the crew, because Oden travelled with Roger. Pattern-seeking monkeys that we are. We see Jesus in the toast and go, "Oh, parallel, got it." But then the story sharpens the wording. Yamato decides to protect Wano, to stay behind so Momo can rule without a Yonko-shaped hole overhead. The promise being kept on the page is, "I will be Oden for this country," not "I will be Oden for this ship." Carrot is even clearer. Her whole arc is resisting responsibility. She's the Zoomer who wants to keep third wheeling with the fun pirates instead of answering the group call from HR. Pedro dies. Inuarashi and Nekomamushi explicitly frame her as the next leader. And she says no, and then the story walks her through accepting that role. The promise she ends with is, "I'll watch over Zoo," not "I'll watch the horizon from the Sunny's mast." So what category are these? They're not failed setups. They're successful, on-page promises about protecting Wano and leading Zoo. The promised straw hat angle is something the audience projected onto the foreshadowing, then retroactively treated as canon when it never left the theory video. This is not a sin. This is normal. Fans do this in every long series. The problem is, when we start filing our own expectations under Oda's broken promises, instead of my Google Doc got rejected by the author. And once you see that with Yamato and Carrot, you start asking a scarier question. How many of the other betrayals people complain about are actually the same thing? So when you zoom out from Yamato and Carrot, you hit the real horror movie twist. We're heading into a part of the story where broken expectations aren't the exception, they're the default. And Egghead is where Oda basically throws every remaining promise into a blender and hits puree. Here's the thing. On the table right now, you've got Luffy's vow to become Pirate King, which in One Piece terms means man who has the most freedom. You've got the Revolutionary Army's promise to topple the Celestial Dragons and flip the world order. You've got Vegapunk's promise to reveal the truth about the Void Century and O'Hara's research to the entire world. And hanging over all of that, you have Emu's implied promise to erase anything that threatens the current system. That's 4 endgame oaths, all pointed at the same pressure point. These are not 4 parallel side quests. Structurally, they are incompatible win conditions. If Luffy becomes Pirate King in the sense Roger defined it, the world government cannot remain intact as we know it. If Dragon actually fulfills the revolutionary promise, the Celestial Dragons and Emu's invisible rule are done. If Vegapunk broadcasts the Void Century, the legitimacy of the government evaporates on contact. And if Emu keeps their promise to erase threats, at least one of those other dreams dies on screen. There is no version where everyone gets a gold star. Egghead is Oda taking that incompatibility and shoving it into one island. I need you to notice how many inherited wills are colliding there. O'Hara's books, saved by Saul, entrusted to Vegapunk. Roger's will, passed to Luffy, intersecting with Vegapunk's research on the ancient weapons and the One Piece itself. Kuma's sacrifice, Dragon's revolution, even Sentomaru's loyalty. It's not just characters meeting. It's entire chains of promises ramming into each other at full speed. Pattern interrupt for your brain. Egghead is not Sabaudi 2.0. It's Enies Lobby O'Hara and Marineford stapled together, but with the author's entire lore Google Drive attached. Every category of promise we've talked about shows up here. Personal vows, systemic oaths, inherited wills, and those creepy unspoken world government promises to keep the peace by any means necessary. And because these are systemic and inherited promises, They don't resolve cleanly. Some will be kept, but only through other people's deaths. Some will be broken, but their will survives in the next generation. Some will be twisted into monkeys' poor versions of themselves, where sure, the revolution happens, but the cost is an Ohara-level atrocity in real time. This is not a sin. This is normal for how Oda's been writing big turning points. Egghead is just the scaled-up version. Listen to me. Casualties are guaranteed here, whether that's characters, institutions, or dreams. We need to stop reading these vows as a checklist of things Oda promised to fans and start reading them as loaded guns pointed at each other. And if you follow that logic through, you can actually start predicting which of these Final Saga promises are structurally allowed to be fulfilled directly, and which ones are almost certainly going to be broken or inherited instead. That's where we're going next. So let's stress test that on the easiest targets in the story, the Straw Hat Dreams. Because if every vow is a loaded gun, then the Thousand Sunny is basically a floating armory. We'll go rapid fire. Luffy first, Pirate King. Tangible progress, obvious. He's taken down warlords, Yonko, has an endgame tier fruit, and the world government has a full-on panic attack every time he breathes. Thematically, he's already the freest man in the room in most scenes. His dream is structurally completable. There is one Piece, one Laugh Tale, one crown. This is set up for a clean, kept resolution, even if the root there is a war crime on the concept of pacing. Zoro, world's greatest swordsman. This is almost comically straightforward. There is a current number 1, Mihawk. Zoro beats Mihawk. Roll credits on that promise. The foreshadowing is blunt. Every major duel is a calibration toward that final fight. He has massive tangible progress and a crystal clear finish line. If Oda doesn't let Zoro personally close this loop, the community will riot and I will be leading the march with a tiny foam sword. Nami wants a map of the entire world. Here's the thing. That sounds concrete, but it's actually an infinite task disguised as a checklist. She's mapped East Blue. She's charting the Grand Line. She's the crew's GPS. Tangible progress? Tons. But a complete map is conceptually unfinishable on screen, unless Oda hard cuts to a time skip montage. This is a dream that's meant to be functionally, not literally, fulfilled. Usopp, brave warrior of the sea. This one is almost entirely thematic. Tangible progress is his wanted posters, and the fact that he's now terrifying to the same villagers he used to bluff. But the real progress is in his behaviour. Staying on Ini's lobby, going back to fight Sugar, standing on Onigashima as a sniper in a war. Can you ever stamp completed on courage? Not really. This is a "this is normal" inherited will style dream. You see it in every coward he inspires. Sanji's All Blue is structurally completable again. It's a location. You either find the magical fish soup ocean or you don't. We've had teases, we've had Grand Line weirdness, but very little concrete progress. That's intentional. This is a late game reveal, clean payoff category. Chopper curing all diseases, conceptually impossible. He's had symbolic wins. Kurea's praise, the Birdman on drum, the ice-only antidote. But all diseases is a statement of method, not a literal to-do list. If anyone's dream is meant to be inherited by the next generation of doctors, it's his. Robin's true history is the opposite. Almost pure tangible progress. Poneglyphs found, road poneglyphs decoded, Ohara's legacy reclaimed. This is one of the few promises where the author clearly pre-wrote a finite answer. Frankie's dream ship sailing to the end? Clean. Brook reuniting with Laboon? Cleanest of all. We literally saw the setup. Jinbei's Fishman equality? That's a world-scale ideological war, not a checkbox. So when you step back, you see the pattern. Maybe half these dreams are structurally designed to be fully kept on screen, and the others are quietly being set up to be twisted, partial, or inherited. And if that's true for the main cast, I need you to imagine what it means for every other promise orbiting them in the Final Saga. And if that's true for everyone orbiting the Straw Hats, we need to talk about the sun in the middle of that solar system, Luffy's Pirate King promise. Because the community has quietly flattened this into the dumbest possible version. Pirate King equals guy who finds Laugh Tale, gets treasure, roll credits. That's the theme park ride version. That's the wiki summary. But listen to me, in the actual story, when Luffy explains it to people who matter, he almost never says, I'll be the guy who finds One Piece. He says over and over, I'll be the Pirate King, and then defines that as the freest man on the sea. That's not a job title. That's a political statement. Here's the thing. Once you accept that definition, his dream stops being a purely personal promise and turns into a systemic one. It's not just, I will reach an island. It's, I will reach a state of existence that, under current world conditions, is structurally impossible. You cannot be the freest man on the sea in a world where the world government can buster call your hometown because a celestial dragon woke up cranky. So suddenly, Pirate King foreshadowing is not just clues about a treasure, it's clues about a regime change. Every time Luffy screams that line in front of Marines, Shichibukai Yonko, he's not just talking career goals, he's declaring that the entire operating system of the world has to be rewritten for that sentence to be true. And Oda has been very intentional about making that clear. Emu on the empty throne, the Gorosei treating countries as disposable, celestial dragons walking around as if human rights are a fun indie concept they never got around to trying. The author is spelling out the problem. Under this system, freest man on the sea is a contradiction in terms. You can be powerful. You can be feared. You cannot be free, which means Luffy's promise is a hybrid category, personal plus systemic. It's I will get there, and I will break the thing that makes there unreachable. And because it's systemic, it almost demands inherited will. One lifetime can topple a government. It cannot permanently guarantee freedom for every future generation. Ask Roger. He reached Laugh Tale, laughed, walked away with the truth, and 20 years later, nothing fundamental changed. The world government is still there. The celestial dragons are still playing God. So even if Luffy reaches Laugh Tale, even if he finds One Piece, there's a real chance the Pirate King promise is only partially kept. He can achieve the feat and still fail the definition. He can stand on the final island and still not be the freest man on the sea, because the system that makes everyone unfree is only cracked, not erased. And that's where this gets dangerous for us as fans, because I need you to consider the possibility that Oda is setting up a deliberately bittersweet, open-ended resolution to the biggest promise in the story. If the main dream is built to be only half keepable, what does that say about every other promise stacked under it? So let's test that on someone concrete, because I need you to see how messy this gets in practice. Zoro's promise is supposed to be the easy one, right? Kid in a dojo, dead friend, world's greatest swordsman. Very clean. Very shonen checklist. Beat Mihawk, get the trophy, roll credits. Except here's the thing. The story has already kicked that ladder out from under you. The community still talks about it as if there's going to be this climactic ESPN pay-per-view where Zoro walks into a stadium, Mihawk walks out, a referee declares, this is the match for the title of world's greatest swordsman. And then boom, promise kept. That's the fantasy. That's the mental category most fans file this in. But Oda has been quietly sabotaging that reading since Baratie. Because Zoro didn't just swear to surpass Mihawk. He went and trained under him. He turned the final boss into his sword dad. And listen to me. Once your rival has been correcting your form for 2 years and watching you chase monkeys with giant swords, a straight, unironic, now we duel to the death for my childhood vow, starts to feel emotionally weird. You can do it, sure. This is not a sin. This is normal shonen behavior. But to make it land, the author would have to reframe the entire thing. Mentor passing the torch. Duel as graduation, not execution. If Mihawk is actively rooting for Zoro to surpass him, are we really watching a grudge match, or are we watching a very intense performance review? And underneath that, there's a more technical problem. World's Greatest Swordsman is not a magical title that gets beamed into your brain when you hit level 100. It's a social label. It exists because the world agrees, more or less, that Mihawk is that guy. Marines, pirates, bounty posters, rumor networks, the whole narrative ecosystem points to one name. In the chaos of the final war, who is even around to certify Zoro's promotion? Picture the end game. Islands falling from the sky, ancient weapons firing, the world government collapsing. Half the people who would care about sword clout are dead or busy, not drowning. Zoro might surpass Mihawk in pure skill in some battlefield moment nobody even sees. From a writing perspective, the promise is technically kept. From a publicity perspective, there's no podium, no belt, no "and the new champion is" announcement. So Zoro becomes our first clear example of a twisted resolution. Spiritually fulfilled, structurally messy. The vow to Kuina is honoured. The scoreboard the fandom wants may never appear on screen. And this is fine. This is, in fact, the point. Because we need to get used to that shape of payoff now, before we start grading every Straw Hat dream on whether it gets a clean trophy scene. Zoro is the warning shot. Promises can be intentionally designed to resolve in the dark, or in the middle of bigger noise. And if that's true for the simple dream, what does that mean for the ones that were never individual to begin with? And if that's true for the simple dream, what does that mean for the ones that were never individual to begin with? Enter Nami and Chopper, the two straw hats whose dreams are basically a middle finger to the concept of completion. Nami doesn't want to map an island. She doesn't even want to map a sea. She wants a complete map of the entire world. Listen to me. In a setting where the ocean literally changes daily, islands move, climates flip on and off, and the calm belt is full of kaiju, that is not a bucket list item. That is a geologist's recurring nightmare. Here's the thing. Cartography in our world is already a lifelong multi-generational project with satellites, GPS, and governments throwing money at it. In One Piece, the government is a conspiracy cult. Half the world is deliberately uncharted, and the other half is being rewritten by natural disasters and pirates every Tuesday. You do not finish that map. You die making better drafts. And Oda leans into that. Every time Nami draws, updates, or studies a log pose that refuses to behave, the story is quietly telling you this isn't a checklist dream. It's a direction of travel. The promise is not, one day I'll hold the final perfect printed world atlas. The promise is, I will spend my life turning chaos into something understandable for me and for the people I care about. Chopper is the same category of problem, just in a lab coat. I want to cure all diseases sounds noble until you remember how medicine actually works. You cure scurvy, you discover deficiency. You cure infection, you discover autoimmunity. You cure one thing, and 3 more crawl out of the wall. This is not a sin. This is not bad planning. This is normal scientific progress. And in One Piece, half the illnesses aren't even biological. They're social and emotional. Chopper's first big miracle is curing a reindeer's loneliness and a quack doctor's despair. He treats a country's grief in Drum, a child soldier's trauma in Punk Hazard, a nation's gas poisoning in Dressrosa. How do you finish curing war, discrimination, slavery, or the void left when your mentor jumps off a cliff for you? So I need you to see what the author is doing here. Oda is not a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast and goes, oh sure, Nami finishes the map by Tuesday, Chopper solves epidemiology on Thursday. These are intentionally asymptotic promises. They are designed so the character can approach them forever without ever touching the asymptote. That means the keeping happens in spirit. Nami keeps her promise every time she charts another impossible sea and hands that knowledge to her crew. Chopper keeps his every time he stands between a stranger and pointless suffering. The payoff is behavioral, not archival. Which is why I will bet you whatever non-existent YouTube money I have that we are not getting a clean Nami holds up the finished map panel or a narrator box that says, and then Chopper cured everything. The more consistent, intentional reading is an ending where Nami's map is obviously still incomplete, but already changing how the world connects. And Chopper has become the doctor who made it possible for the next generation to go even further. In other words, these are promises built to be inherited. And if some dreams are structurally unfinishable, what do you do with the ones that were never meant for one lifetime in the first place? So if Nami and Chopper are carrying promises they literally cannot finish, we need to talk about the weird middle children of the crew. The ones whose dreams are almost suspiciously completable. Because not every Straw Hat was built to hand the baton to the next generation. Some of them were built to stand at the finish line and go, yeah, I did it. Start with Usopp. On paper, become a brave warrior of the sea sounds external. You expect a title, a ceremony, something where the universe stamps his passport. Congratulations, you are now brave. But here's the thing. Oda quietly framed that dream as a perception problem, not a power scaling problem. Usopp already snipes a marine flag at Eni's lobby, terrifies Sugar in Dressrosa, stands his ground on Onigashima. The world keeps reacting to him as brave long before he believes it. So the foreshadowing for Usopp's payoff isn't a specific island, it's his self-talk. Every I'm a coward gag is a progress bar. The author doesn't need a giant plot device, he just needs one clean moment where Usopp is terrified, knows he's terrified, and still says, I am a brave warrior of the sea. Without irony, that's it. Dream cashed. Internal promise, internal resolution. And it fits Oda's very intentional pattern of turning running jokes into emotional landmines. Frankie is the opposite. His dream is aggressively external. Build a ship that sails to the end of the world. That is a binary condition. Either the Thousand Sunny reaches Laugh Tale, or it doesn't. There's no philosophical debate. No, it was about the journey. The ship either survives the literal endgame, or we riot. And because Oda is a structural gremlin, he has been telegraphing this. Adam Wood, the obsession with durability, the way Merry's death traumatizes the entire crew's relationship with ships. Sunny is pre-written to be the anti-Merry. So the moment that Bo cuts through the last storm and the narrator tells you, this ship sailed to the end of the world, that's Frankie's promise fulfilled in one shot. Clean, visual, undeniable. Brook's vow to reunite with Laboon might be the single most straightforward promise in the entire story. It is literally a 50-year Chekhov's gun. You don't set up a whale banging his head against Reverse Mountain. Reveal the musician who promised to come back, keep that thread emotionally active for 1,000 chapters, and then go, actually, off-screen. Even for an author who enjoys hurting you, that would be deranged. So we all know what's coming. The community has already pre-cried this scene. Brook steps off the Sunny, the Rumbar theme swells, Laboon recognises the tone of a single note, and every fan who made fun of Oda's goofy skeleton gets spiritually suplexed. This is not a sin. This is how you pay off an absurdly long, meticulously planned setup. Jinbe sits in between those extremes. Fishman equality is huge, systemic, and technically outside one man's control. But Oda has been carving it into manageable milestones from Arlong Park onward. Fisher Tiger's tragedy, Kuina Tahime's petition, the Reverie vote, the prophecy about Fishman Island moving under the sun. Each one is a checkbox. So when Fishman Island actually relocates to the surface, or when a fishman sits openly in some world summit without a single slur being thrown, that's Jinbei's version of brave warrior. Not total utopia, but visible structural change. His dream overlaps with the Revolutionary Army, with Luffy's promise to topple the Celestial Dragon's world. But Jinbei gets a clear on-screen win that says, the arc of this universe is bending. Put these four together and you get the cleanest promise category in One Piece. Usopp's internal courage, Frankie's end-of-the-world ship, Brook's reunion, Jinbei's tangible progress toward equality. These are the promises Oda is almost obligated to keep in full view to balance out the inherited dreams and the quietly broken vows. Which should make you nervous, by the way, because if some promises are structurally protected, that means others are structurally disposable. And the pattern of who gets which kind might be pointing at a much darker endgame than most fans are prepared to accept. So if some promises are built into the bones of the story, here's the thing. The world government's promises are built into the propaganda. They're not there to be kept. They're there to be believed. Peace, order, justice, safety from pirates and chaos. That's the official brochure. That's the mission statement printed on the Marine recruitment posters while a buster call is vaporizing another island off screen. On paper, it's simple. You give up freedom, they give you security. You let the celestial dragons sit on a space throne. They make sure your village doesn't get burned down by some rando with a Jolly Roger. This is the grand social contract of One Piece's world, and the story spends 20 plus years methodically proving that contract was written in disappearing ink. Ohara is the cleanest example. The government promises peace and order, then drops 10 battleships on a library because the authors of history are a bigger threat than any Yonko. That's not a broken promise in the moment. That's a reveal that the promise was never aimed at you. Peace is for the nobles. Order is for the archive. Everyone else is collateral. Eni's lobby takes the justice part. This is literally the island where justice is supposed to live, and there is a permanent hole in the sky from how often they fire the world's biggest death sentence. Trials are a formality. Evidence is optional. The whole arc is Oda grabbing you by the face and going, "The word justice here is branding, not morality. The flag says absolute justice. The practice is absolutely whoever we feel like erasing today." Dressrosa exposes the protection promise. The world government recognizes Doflamingo, a warlord and ex-celestial dragon, as a legitimate king while he's running a human trafficking ring and a smile factory. The Marines are stationed there. The Reverie crowd knows him. Nobody intervenes until it becomes politically inconvenient. Protection in this system is not a universal right. It's a subscription service for the politically useful. And then Reverie zooms out and shows you the systemic rot. You get kings begging for help, kingdoms suffering under the heavenly tribute, and Mary Geowise treating slaves as interior decoration while the elders talk about maintaining balance. This is where the foreshadowing about a world government from chapter 100 cashes out, not as a flawed institution that occasionally fails its ideals, but as an institution whose ideals were a mask for control from day one. The Marines are the tragic middlemen in this. Smoker, Fujitora, even Garp. These are people who actually believe in the poster. They signed up for peace and justice. They keep crashing headfirst into the reality that their employer is the biggest repeat offender. Fujitora literally blindfolds himself to avoid seeing the hypocrisy, then gambles his career to force the government to admit Dressrosa happened. Smoker keeps getting reassigned because he insists on pursuing actual pirates instead of the ones the paperwork tells him to. Listen to me. That tension is not a side plot. It's Oda classifying these as systemic promises. Promises that are structurally impossible to fulfill because the system was designed around the opposite goal. The justice slogan is a UI skin over a program that runs on fear and censorship. You don't patch that with a new fleet admiral. You uninstall the OS. Which is why, heading into the Final Saga, we need to stop pretending this is just the story of one pirate keeping his word to Shanks. The real endgame is a world forced to confront the gap between its stated ideals and its documented war crimes. Luffy's hat promise is important, sure, but the bigger question is, when the dust settles, whose promises get to define what justice means next? And if you've been tracking how Oda treats broken promises so far, the answer he's steering you toward is not the people currently in charge. So if the people in charge aren't allowed to define justice anymore, who is? Because here's the thing. There are already competing future blueprints installed in this world, and every single one of them is a promise. They're not just ideologies. They're IOUs written to millions of people you and I will never meet on panel. Start with Dragon and the Revolutionary Army. Their whole existence is a response brief to the world government's broken advertising campaign. The government promised stability, safety, justice under the Marines. In practice, O'Hara, God Valley, the Goa Kingdom trash heap, the oh-so-mysterious cleansing during the reverie. So Dragon's counter-promise is brutally simple. Overthrow the celestial dragons and build a more just world. Not a nicer Marine branch. Not a better PR slogan. A world where the very category of God who can buy slaves is deleted from the database. That is a systemic promise. It's not, I'll protect this island. It's, I will change the operating system of the planet. And because Oda is an intentional author, that has been foreshadowed forever. Luffy's dad, Sabo's trauma, Kuma's sacrifice, the network of kingdoms quietly funding this revolution. The writing is screaming at you that this is not a side quest. Now, contrast that with the Yonko. Their promises are smaller on paper, but way more personal in delivery. Whitebeard tells his territories, "Under my flag you are family. No one touches you." Big Mum says, "Under my flag you get a candy-based utopia, as long as you pay tribute and don't mind the occasional child abduction." Shanks walks into a war zone and, with one sentence, guarantees, "If you keep fighting, you fight me," and everyone suddenly remembers other plans they had. Those are protection contracts, protection in exchange for allegiance, and they range from Whitebeard's found family socialism to Big Mom's multicolour protection racket. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is exactly how real power vacuums work. People trade freedom for security because the alternative is a buster call. Pattern interrupt. I need you to imagine being a random fisherman in Whitebeard's territory. You don't care about the Void Century. You care that your kid comes home. For you, the promised future is not Dragon's manifesto. It's the giant old man on your island's newspaper headline. Now here's the problem. These promises cannot all be kept. If the revolutionaries win and dismantle the world government structure, they also dismantle the geopolitical conditions that let Yonko carve out private kingdoms. If a new, truly just system emerges, the idea of a single pirate emperor owning your safety becomes obsolete. Whitebeard's vow, Big Mom's deal, even Shanks's quiet guardianship, structurally broken, flip it. If a Yonko-centered order persists, if Shanks's balance or Blackbeard's nightmare empire becomes the default, Dragon's promise of a just, egalitarian world dies on arrival. The systemic promise and the personal protection promises are in direct, zero-sum conflict. The author has planned a world where some oaths must lose, so we need to emotionally prepare for this. Some beloved characters are going to fail their stated goals, not because Oda forgot, but because the storytelling demands it. This is normal. In a pre-written endgame, certain dreams are scheduled to be inherited, corrupted, or buried. And if you think that sounds harsh, wait until we zoom back down from world-scale revolutions to the Straw Hats themselves, and ask which of their promises even can survive the ending Oda's been foreshadowing. So we zoom back down, and instead of the Straw Hats' dreams, we slam face first into the oldest broken promise in the story, Joy Boy's apology. That poneglyph in Fishman Island, that is not vague lore. That is an in-universe receipt. Sorry I couldn't keep my promise. The author literally carved my bad into an indestructible rock. Foreshadowing doesn't get clearer than that. The text is telling you there was a concrete plan in the Void Century. It failed, and everyone underwater has been living in the shadow of that failure for 800 years. This isn't a mythic vibe. It's a missed appointment. Joy Boy promised the people of Fishman Island something monumental, probably connected to moving them to the surface, and then history hard crashed. Now, here's the thing. That promise is not just a sad backstory. It's structurally wired into the present through Poseidon. Shirahoshi is not a random princess with a cool power. She is the reincarnation of a role, a position, a planned solution, a being who can command sea kings so absolutely that move an entire civilization to safer waters stops being a dream and becomes a logistical problem. Need to tow Noah? Need to escort an island? She is the answer key walking around crying and talking to giant sea monsters. I need you to see how intentional that is. Joy Boy's apology plus Noah plus Poseidon is a closed system. It's an engineering project that stalled for 800 years. And in this category of promise, Oda is not freestyling. He decided the core pieces before Chapter 1 and then drip-fed them out of order. Fans treat it as mystical prophecy. The writing treats it as a delayed construction job. Then we add Pluton and Uranus, and suddenly the ancient weapons stop being random nukes and start reading as different proposed fixes to a broken world. Pluton, the brute force option, a warship that can erase islands and by extension oppressive regimes or entire seas. Uranus, the wild card, potentially a sky-based weapon or force that can reshape the heavens, the red line, the weather, the literal structure of the map. Poseidon, the migration tool, a way to relocate the oppressed instead of annihilating the oppressors. So you get 3 categories of solution: destruction, relocation, revelation. Blow it up, move it, or expose it. And all of them orbit the same problem Joy Boy failed to solve. A world order built on segregation, lies, and broken promises to entire races. Listen to me. Joy Boy's vow is a broken promise that the story has already reassigned. Luffy inherits the will to tear down the system. Shirahoshi inherits the practical ability to move her people. Robin inherits the knowledge to explain what went wrong. The ancient weapons are not temptations for random villains. They are the pre-written toolkit for finally keeping an 800-year-old promise, which means the series is committed to resolving it, not morally obligated. Structurally obligated. You do not spend decades foreshadowing a specific apology just to shrug and roll credits. But here's where the community's optimism crashes into the author's planning. Resolving that promise does not mean everyone gets a happy ending. This is not a sin. This is normal in long-form storytelling. We need to be honest. Moving Fishman Island, destroying the Red Line, triggering an all-blue, unleashing Pluton, any of those solutions can drown people, erase countries, or murder dreams. Someone's paradise is someone else's apocalypse. And Oda has been quietly telling you that some promises can only be kept by breaking others. So the real question isn't, will Joy Boy's promise be fulfilled? It's whose promise has to die to pay for it. And if you think the answer is none of the straw hats, I have some very uncomfortable patterns to show you in the next section. So when I say whose promise has to die to pay for it, I'm not being poetic, I'm being literal. Because there is a whole category of promise in One Piece where the person making it has no idea they're signing anything. I'm talking about the will of D. Here's the thing. On the surface, D carriers are just a weird trivia tag. Gold D Roger, Monkey D Luffy, Trafalgar D Waterloo. They pop up at turning points. They laugh in the face of execution, and the world government quietly files them under enemies of God and pretends it's just a coincidence. This is not a coincidence. This is not normal. Or rather, in this story, this is normal in a very specific, weaponized way. Every time a D shows up, history bends. Roger triggers the Great Pirate Era. Luffy burns Enies Lobby's flag, punches a celestial dragon, and turns Impel Down into a revolving door. Law dismantles Dressrosa's political theatre. Even Ace, whose big promise is just, "I'll make Whitebeard king," ends up dying in a way that permanently brands the world government as butchers. These are not random dreamers. They're pressure points. So here's the proposal. The will of D is a promise, not a personal vow, not a cute "I'll be Pirate King" declaration, but a meta promise made by an ancient group that hated a certain kind of world. A world of fake peace, erased history, and gods on pedestals. That promise gets buried with them, but the contract doesn't expire. It moves into bloodlines. It keeps walking around in people who have never read the terms and conditions. In other words, D isn't a middle initial. It's an inherited, systemic promise. It predates Luffy, predates Roger, predates the current cast by centuries. When Luffy says, "I'll be Pirate King," he thinks he's making a personal dream statement. What he's actually doing is plugging his little kid vow into a pre-written endgame. The author already decided what the D faction stands for. The foreshadowing is that their dreams always collide with the same enemy structure. Listen to me. That's why their promises all trend in the same direction. Freedom. Upending the world. Dragging the sun into places that were supposed to stay dark. Luffy's "I'll be Pirate King." Law's "I'll destroy Doflamingo." Roger's "I won't tell you about the One Piece. Go find it yourselves." Different wording, same underlying contract clause. Oppose this world and its fake stability. And because it's inherited, there's a built-in cruelty. We need to accept that some D carriers are going to die without ever fully understanding what they were keeping. Ace dies thinking he's a failure, not a relay runner. Saul dies protecting O'Hara's books, not realizing he's literally hauling the ancient promise into the next century. Even Roger, who gets the closest, still has to bet everything on kids who aren't born yet. I need you to see how brutal that is from a writing perspective. Oda is foreshadowing an ending where closure is optional, but continuation is mandatory. The promise matters more than the promiser. And if that's true for the D clan, you should be very nervous about what it means for the Straw Hats' individual dreams in the next section. And here's where the fandom makes everything worse. Because the moment you start talking about promises that might not be kept, the community brain does this thing. It panics. It starts grabbing every line, every panel composition, every cover story and going, no, see, Oda promised this will matter later. And I need you to hear this. Most of that is not a promise. It is seasoning. It is flavor text. It is sometimes straight up misdirection. We need to be honest about what we do. A background marine from a 2003 cover story smiles once at a seagull, and suddenly there are threads insisting he's going to lead a revolutionary squad in the final war. A throwaway gag where Usopp says he'll have 10 billion followers becomes a binding foreshadowing of his future fleet. Someone on a colour spread stands near a sword, and we decide that's a secret oath to become the world's greatest swordsman's rival's cousin. This is not Oda. This is us. Here's the thing. Our brains are pattern-seeking monkeys that would rather see Jesus in toast than admit breakfast is random. Pareidolia is the technical term. You stare at enough clouds, you see dragons. You stare at enough One Piece panels, you see promises. Confirmation bias then kicks in. You remember the one time a cover story character did show up in Marineford, and you forget the 50 others who retired into eternal SBS purgatory. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is what being a fan feels like. The problem is, when we start labeling every coincidence as foreshadowing and every vibe as an explicit promise from the author, when everything is a Chekhov's gun, nothing is. You flatten the whole story into one giant red string conspiracy board where a bartender's apron pattern is definitely a roadmap to Laugh Tale. Pattern interrupt for a second. What if Oda is allowed to write a joke that stays a joke? What if a cover story can just be him unwinding without secretly seeding the ancient weapons? If that question makes you a little defensive, that's the point. We've trained ourselves to treat being wrong about a theory as the author breaking a promise, instead of admitting we just overreached. Listen to me. Over-assigning promises makes the real ones harder to see. When you put Luffy's vow to Shanks in the same category as that one-time kid glanced at a shadowy figure on a cover, you're disrespecting the craft. There is a difference between an explicit vow, a strongly implied narrative setup, and pure fan projection. Only one of those is guaranteed to pay off. One is a strong maybe, one is you yelling at clouds. So going forward, I need you to start sorting. When a character says, I will do X, that's a promise. When the story quietly rearranges the board to make X possible, that's setup. When your favorite YouTuber circles a background fish and calls it Joy Boy's pet, that's content. And the way Oda treats those three categories is the key to understanding which dreams in this story are actually in danger in the next section. And here's where the community quietly breaks its own brain. We sort promises, we track them, we make spreadsheets, and then we start grading Oda on a pass/fail rubric. Did he keep it? Did he resolve it? Gold star or plot hole? And I need you to hear how insane that is for a weakly human being and not an immortal content vending machine. Because that's what this Oda never drops anything myth does. It turns him from an author into a customer service department. You didn't get your side character vow from Syrup Village processed within 800 chapters? File a ticket. This is the problem. Once every line becomes a binding contract, there's no room for trade-offs, no room for priorities, no room for the story to grow in directions he didn't anticipate when he was 22 and drawing clown pirates. Listen to me. Real skill in long-form writing is not just in what you execute. It's in what you abandon. It's in what you twist into a new category. Think about all those early, I'll come back and free this island declarations from minor arcs. Technically, yeah, a lot of those are still floating in limbo. But would you honestly trade the entire pacing of Water 7 or Marineford to go back and do a thorough follow-up tour of every single East Blue villager with a dream board? Here's the thing. When the story shifts, the promises have to either evolve or die. This is not a sin. This is normal. Oda retrofits Sky PA's mantra into Haki, and suddenly an odd little Sky arc becomes structural foreshadowing for the entire power system. At the same time, a dozen side characters from that arc never get their 10 years later epilogue. The gain is a coherent combat language for the new world. The loss is some neat, checklist-style closure. That's not failure, that's prioritization. Take Inherited Will. Kuina and Zoro's promise is technically broken. She never becomes the world's greatest swordsman. The story doesn't apologize. It doubles down. Her vow mutates into Zoro's vow, which mutates again into this generational relay of swordsmen and teachers. The original promise dies so the theme can live. Same with the Will of D. Half the people who carry that initial never get to cash in on whatever cosmic contract it represents. Their broken promises are the compost that grows Luffy's, and that's why the ones that do pay off hit so hard. Laboon waiting 50 years for a crew that never returns only works because we've seen dreams fail. Robin screaming, I want to live, only lands because we've watched other characters never get that chance. If every single promise in One Piece got a tidy resolution, those moments would feel manufactured, the narrative equivalent of a punch card rewards program. So we need to stop praising Oda only when he behaves like a perfectly calibrated foreshadowing robot, and start praising the flexibility, the emotional honesty in the broken stuff, the dropped side character dreams that quietly tell you, no, not everyone gets their miracle. Because once you see which promises he's willing to sacrifice, you can start asking a much scarier question. Which current promises are secretly on the chopping block? So how do you look at a brand new promise in a weekly chapter and not turn into a clown with a red nose and a 40-tweet theory thread? We need to give you a checklist. We need to turn you from pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast into functioning reader of serialized fiction. This is not a sin, this is normal. First pass, What category is this promise actually in? Personal, systemic, or dream level? Personal is Usopp saying, "I'll be brave next time." Systemic is the world government promising justice, or some celestial dragon offering reforms. Dream level is, "I'll find all blue. I'll become Pirate King. I'll destroy the Red Line." Here's the thing. Those three categories do not behave the same in Oda's storytelling. Personal promises get broken or bent constantly for character growth. Systemic promises are almost designed to be lies. Dream-level stuff is where the real foreshadowing lives. Second pass. Logistics. Is this even physically possible inside the world the author has already shown you? A drunk side character saying he'll overthrow the Tenryubito alone? That's not a setup. That's a bit. A kid in some East Blue village swearing to become the strongest in the world with zero haki, zero boat, and zero name. Flag that as emotional colour unless the story keeps coming back to them. When Oda is serious, he scaffolds the logistics, multiple arcs, allies, ancient weapons, poneglyphs, actual infrastructure, third pass, echo check. Does this promise rhyme with an older one? When Momonosuke talks about opening Wano, that's not just a kid's vow. It's echoing Odin. It's echoing Joy Boy. It's stapled to Void Century history. When a promise is sitting on top of three older promises, that's not casual. That's pre-writing territory. That's intentional. Now, wait the speaker. I need you to stop treating every vow as equal. A random gag character in a cover story? Low weight. A straw hat declaring their dream again. Post-time skip? High weight. An ancient inscription on a poneglyph? That's basically the author standing on your desk with a megaphone. The more permanent and global the source, the heavier the promise. Then ask the rude question, does the story benefit more from keeping this promise or breaking it? Not do I want it kept, not would it be wholesome, but what gives better drama? Kuina and Zoro's promise only works because it breaks. Laboon and Brook's promise only works because it's kept. Both are planned. Both are intentional. And finally, start tagging inherited will setups. Deathbed vows, anything tied to the will of D. Dreams that are obviously too big for one lifetime. Those are not meant to be completed by the original owner. They're relay races. Once you see that, you can enjoy weekly chapters without overhyping every line of dialogue. You can watch promises fail in real time and go, ah, that one was never for them. Which is where this gets dangerous. Because once you have that toolkit, you can start applying it to the handful of promises that actually define the ending. So let's actually swing the hammer. We've built the framework, we've talked categories, now we need to point it at the big glowing promises the community obsesses over and ask, which of these are structurally doomed? Start with the obvious. 1. Luffy's vow to become Pirate King. This is the least controversial. This is planned to be kept. The entire story is a machine whose output is Luffy is the freest man on the sea. But here's the thing. Being Pirate King is a status, not a solution. The foreshadowing around Roger, around Laughtail, around Joy Boy screams that Luffy will reach the end, ring the bell, punch a god. It does not promise that he personally installs permanent world peace, writes a constitution, and manages post-revolution tax policy. So yes, promise kept. But the fantasy that Luffy alone fixes everything? That's already being set up to break. Nami's map of the world is actually more fragile. Cartography is work. It takes time, stability, and not being chased by 10 different government kill squads. Structurally, this dream is built to be inherited or approximated. She'll chart the grand line, she'll assemble pieces no one else has, but the complete map of the entire world reads to me as Kuina's 2001 jewels. A promise that defines a life, not a checkbox that gets ticked on panel. I'm betting twisted fulfillment here. The knowledge Nami gathers becomes the foundation for a true global map someone else finishes. Now, controversial one. I need you to breathe. Chopper's cure-all dream? I do not think we are getting a literal panacea. The writing has been very intentional about him curing impossible illnesses one by one, sure, but the pattern is that he keeps running into new horrors. Ice Oni, smile side effects, ancient diseases. The author is quietly telling you that suffering in this world is systemic, not just viral. So I think Chopper's promise resolves as a category shift. He doesn't cure everything. He revolutionizes medicine, creates a framework, trains doctors. He cures the idea that some people are beyond saving. That's a promise twisted, not broken. Jim B's equality dream and the revolutionaries' vow to topple the celestial dragons sit in the same structural bucket. These are not one arc and done promises. These are multi-generation movements. The foreshadowing around Fisher Tiger, Otohime, Sabo Kuma, even Nika imagery, all points to inherited will. The current cast will land the decisive blow, but absolute equality and a permanently dragon-free world, that's propaganda, not planning. We're watching the spark, not the finished bonfire. Vegapunk's promise to reveal the Void Century is the funniest one, because listen to me, this man is a narrative dead man walking. His promise is a time bomb whose entire function is to be interrupted, fragmented, scattered. The reveal is already being distributed through Robin O'Hara's books. The Poneglyphs. Vegapunk's role is to guarantee the truth exists, not to personally give a TED talk on ancient war crimes. And I want you to mentally bookmark all of this. Not as prophecy, as an experiment. When One Piece ends, come back and ask which promises were designed to fail and which ones I just completely whiffed on as a pattern-seeking monkey seeing Jesus in toast. Because next, we need to talk about how Oda weaponizes those failures emotionally. Because here's the thing, once you start seeing broken promises as a feature, not a bug, you also have to admit something way more uncomfortable. The ending everyone in the community keeps building mood boards for, that thing is fan fiction. It's the perfect One Piece ending where every Straw Hat cashes out their dream in a clean, literal way. Luffy becomes Pirate King, personally punches Imu into the sun, and somehow abolishes world hunger on the way down. Nami maps the entire globe, Robin publishes the true history, and nobody censors it. Sanji finds All Blue and opens a Yelp-approved restaurant. Usopp becomes a legendary warrior without ever being truly humiliated again. Every villain is defeated. The world government is reformed into a Scandinavian social democracy, and all the allies retire to a giant found family barbecue with Laboon in the background. No one important dies. Trauma is cured. The sea is fixed. Roll credits. Listen to me. That is not the story Oda has been writing for 25 years. That is the Marvel Phase 4 crossover event in your head. Look at the actual pattern. Major explicit promises get broken or rerouted constantly. Ace promises he'll never die. Odin promises he'll open Wano. Kuina promises she'll become the world's greatest swordsman. None of those are kept in the literal poster on your wall way. Instead, their dreams get inherited. Luffy carries Ace's will forward. Momonosuke and the Scabbards stagger toward Odin's promise at enormous cost. Zoro turns Kuina's vow into his entire personality. Joy Boy fails spectacularly, and that failure becomes the foreshadowing scaffold for Luffy's Nika awakening centuries later. The author is telling you, as loudly as he can, that systemic change in this world is built on top of graves. So when fans say, well, obviously every Straw Hat promise is going to resolve neatly in the Final Saga, I need you to hear how that clashes with the data. Some things are planned to pay off clean. Laboon and Brook's 50-year promise is basically Chekhov's whale. Frankie building the ship that reaches the end of the world? That one has neon lights around it. Those are the Laboon category promises, intentionally set up to land satisfyingly because the storytelling needs anchor points. But around those anchors, Oda keeps sprinkling the brutal stuff. Vivi promising to sail with them again and then not getting on the ship. Fisher Tiger promising liberation and dying under a world that barely moves. The Revolutionary Army promising revolution and repeatedly eating losses off screen. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is the cost column. A thematically honest ending probably sits right in that tension. We get the laugh tale reveal, we get some dreams fulfilled, we get some institutions shattered, and we also get inherited responsibilities, half-kept vows, and a world that is better, but not fixed. This is fine. This is normal for a story that has spent decades telling you that inherited will is more important than any one person's bucket list. That doesn't mean the ending will be bleak. It means it will be bittersweet. Some promises will resolve on screen. Some will be handed to the next generation. Some will be left as scars. And the real emotional punch is whether you're ready for that. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question we need to tackle next. What happens when the promise that breaks is Luffy's? So when I say, what happens if Luffy's promise breaks, I need you to resist the reflexive YouTube comment answer of then Oda fumbled the bag. Because here's the thing, a broken promise is not automatically a broken story. Those are different categories. One is a choice in the writing. The other is a failure of the writing. We need to separate two things the community constantly mashes together. There's a broken promise the story knows is broken, sits with, bleeds over. And there's the dangling thread the author genuinely forgets, where nobody on the page seems to remember it existed. Ace's promise to never die. The narrative drags you through the consequences of that failure. Meanwhile, some random East Blue Side character swearing they'll be the greatest pumpkin farmer on the Grand Line and never showing up again. That's not a plot hole. That's atmospheric noise. When Ace dies, the story doesn't treat his vow as a typo. It treats it as a wound. Luffy's entire worldview shatters. Garp's faith in the Marines cracks. Sabo's whole adult life is a retroactive response to a promise he failed to keep. The brokenness is acknowledged, recontextualized, weaponized. That's intentional storytelling. That's not Oda tripping over his own foreshadowing. That's him using a failed promise as the core of Marineford's emotional gravity. And once you start looking for it, you see this pattern everywhere. Kuina and Zoro's childhood promise is broken in the most mundane, unfair way possible. She dies off screen, no epic duel, no payoff. Yet that absence becomes Zoro's engine. Nami never gets Belmare back. Instead, the promise mutates into her obsession with maps and her refusal to abandon villages under Arlong-type oppression. These are promises that fail in-world and then grow new branches in the characters' heads. That's not a problem. That's the point. Listen to me. As long as the emotional and thematic consequences exist, a broken promise can strengthen the narrative. It can create new alliances that only make sense because the old vow collapsed. Sabo joining the Revolutionary Army is a direct response to Ace and Luffy's childhood dreams going sideways. Law's alliance with Luffy is born from a revenge mission that cannot possibly restore what was lost. The story keeps saying, you can't fix this, but you can decide what you do next. Our pattern-seeking monkey brains, the same ones that see Jesus in Toast and confirmed foreshadowing in every background seagull, want every vow to be neatly fulfilled. When it isn't, the instinct is to scream bad writing. This is not a sin. This is normal. In a 1,000-chapter epic with evolving priorities, some promises are going to be abandoned, some are going to be inverted, and some were never meant to be kept in the first place. Broken promises are how One Piece stays honest about change. Real revolutions don't meet their deadlines. Real dreams get inherited, corrupted, half completed. The Will of D is basically the thesis statement. The world is moved by people failing, dying, and handing their unfinished promises to whoever's still standing. This is fine. Which brings us back to Luffy. If the story has been this honest about everyone else's broken vows, what does that imply about the one promise the entire narrative is orbiting? So here's where I need you to throw out one of the biggest myths in the community. Oda is not a 4D chess god who sat down at age 22, planned every single promise, every payoff, every SBS gag, and then just pressed print for 30 years. That vision of the author is comforting. It's also completely unrealistic and, honestly, kind of disrespectful to what he's actually doing. Because if you imagine Oda as an omniscient god, then every dropped thread becomes a crime scene. Every unfulfilled vow is bad foreshadowing or lazy writing. You turn the entire story into a gotcha puzzle where your job as a fan is to catch him slipping. And listen to me, that's not how any human being writes a weekly manga for a quarter of a century without exploding. Here's the thing. A better metaphor isn't chess master, it's ruthless gardener. Oda plants way more seeds than he can ever grow. He throws in promises, side characters, weird aesthetic choices, half-formed ideas about ancient weapons, and then he waits to see which ones sprout. Some become Laboon and Brook, a 50-year promise that turns into one of the cleanest payoffs in the medium. Some become that kid from that one East Blue Island who never matters again. This is not a sin. This is normal. And a ruthless gardener doesn't just plant, he prunes aggressively. You can see it in how certain crew dreams go quiet for hundreds of chapters while others surge to the front. You can feel it in how mantra becomes formalized as Haki once he realizes the story needs a unified combat system. That is not a retcon disaster. That's course correction. That's an author looking at the jungle he's grown and saying, okay, these branches stay, these branches die. The payoff of that approach is organic discovery, emotional truth. When Kinemon's goofy dragon bit suddenly reframes as Wano trauma, that feels real precisely because Oda let the character breathe before deciding how deep to cut. When Nika imagery slowly accretes around Luffy, you can argue about how early it was planned, but the emotional effect is that the story is revealing itself to you in real time, not reading off a corporate PowerPoint. I need you to understand how important this is. Appreciating Oda means respecting both halves, the long-term vision and the willingness to break his own toys when a better toy appears. Sometimes that means a promise gets twisted. Sometimes it means a promise gets quietly abandoned in the mulch so something stronger can grow in its place. That's not a bug in the storytelling. That's the process. Pattern interrupt time. If every single seed from chapter 1 paid off perfectly, you would hate it. You'd feel the rails. You'd see the outline. The messy pattern we actually have, the mix of kept, delayed and broken promises, is evidence of active storytelling, not failure. Which means instead of asking, did he plan this in 1997, we need to start asking a much better question. What does he choose to keep pruning toward now, especially when it comes to Luffy's final promise? So if the real question is, what is Oda pruning toward now, we also need to talk about what we're pruning toward in our own heads. Because the way we talk about promises in this community, it's a mess, it's emotional. It's you, me, and every other pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in Toast screaming, Oda promised, at a panel where a 12-year-old cries in the rain. Here's the thing. The phrase Oda promised X does a ton of sneaky damage. It collapses 3 different layers of storytelling into one accusation. The author, the narrative voice, and the character's mouth all get fused into this single cosmic guarantee. Instead, I need you to start saying boring, precise stuff. The story strongly implies X. This character vows Y. The world government claims Z. Same panels, same hype, way less brain poison, because now you're not putting words in the author's mouth every time a kid swears on his sword. And while we're cleaning house, we need to retire the fake certainty. You don't have facts, you have predictions. This is normal, this is fine. Call them that. Say, my prediction is that Zoro's promise to Kuina ends in a twisted fulfillment. And then separately admit, what I want is a perfect, clean victory. That gap between what the text is actually setting up and what I personally crave is where 80% of fandom meltdowns live. When you blur them, every subversion feels like betrayal instead of, planned writing. So here's a simple debate rule I want you to smuggle into your group chat. Before you argue about a broken promise, you have to do 3 things. 1, quote the exact chapter and wording of the vow. 2, say who's speaking and who it's to. 3, classify it. Is this a personal vow, a crew dream, an inherited will, or a systemic promise from the world government that was never intentional in the first place? Suddenly you notice that Nami's promise to Belmare, Luffy's hat promise to Shanks, and the Tenryuabito's protection of their citizens are not in the same category at all. Once you have that shared vocabulary, kept, broken, twisted, inherited, personal versus systemic versus dream, you stop yelling Oda lied and start saying this was always an inherited will promise. It was never meant to be kept by that kid in that flashback. The disagreement doesn't go away, but it gets narrower, less personal, less you're stupid for reading it wrong, and more we're arguing over whether this was foreshadowing or just thematic background noise. This is not a sin. This is how adults argue about storytelling instead of having a quote tweet war. And I need you to be the annoying hero of your server. Be the one who gently drops, was that actually a promise or just a vibe? When the hype train is doing 200 kilometers per H off a cliff. Because once you start asking that question, some of One Piece's most sacred promises start looking very different. Especially the ones pointing straight at Luffy's ending. So here's the uncomfortable follow-up to that question. What happens when you point that "was that actually a promise" lens at your own nostalgia? I need you to do a tiny experiment with me. In your head, pull up your top 3 One Piece moments. Not arcs, not characters. Specific scenes. Got them? Cool. Now, listen to me. How many of those are really just promise moments in disguise? A promise being made, a promise being broken, or a promise finally, painfully being kept? Take Robin on Eni's lobby. On the surface, that's a rescue arc with cool train fights and a big government logo exploding. But the moment that lives rent-free in your brain is her screaming, "I want to live." Why? Because that's not just a confession. That's her finally accepting the Straw Hats' insane promise. We will take on the entire world for you, and we will not abandon you the way everyone else did. The tension isn't, will Luffy win this fight? The tension is, will this woman dare to believe in a promise again, or will reality crush it one more time? Same with Luffy putting the hat on Nami in Arlong Park. Everyone remembers the walk to Arlong Park and the punch, but the spine of that whole sequence is a silent contract. He puts the hat on her head, the most precious symbol of his promise to Shanks, and says without saying, "Your burden is my burden now." That's not just good animation. That's intentional storytelling where an object is carrying accumulated promise debt. Zoro at Thriller Bark? That's literally a man weaponizing a promise. His childhood vow to Kuina, his stated goal to become the world's greatest swordsman, all of that compresses into nothing happened. That line only hits because you understand he is cashing in every promise he ever made to stand between Luffy and the consequences of being Luffy. The foreshadowing there isn't just scars and rivalry. It's years of planned promise building, detonating in one foggy field. And then the Going Merry's funeral. That ship is not a character in the traditional category. It doesn't speak, it doesn't have a backstory panel in the SBS. But you cried anyway. Why? Because the Merry is literally a vessel made of promises. Usopp's pride, Kaya's gift, the Straw Hats' dream to reach the Grand Line. The tragedy isn't the boat broke. The tragedy is our first shared promise couldn't survive the reality of the sea. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, Oda being brutally honest about how the world treats your dreams. Here's the thing. You think you're responding to cool choreography or sad deaths. You're not. You're responding to the uncertainty around whether a promise can survive contact with reality. That's the real problem your brain is tracking in every big scene, even when you're busy being a pattern-seeking monkey, seeing foreshadowing in every background seagull. Once you see that, future arcs change. You start noticing when the author very intentionally frames a vow, or dodges making one, or buries it in a joke. You start seeing the promise machinery under the surface, the little narrative engines Oda installs years before he needs them. And we need to say this clearly. Promises are not decorative dialogue in One Piece. They are the emotional skeleton. Break that skeleton and the whole story collapses, which raises a much nastier question. If promises are the bones of this story, what happens when Oda starts snapping them on purpose? So here's the uncomfortable version of that question. If Oda is snapping the bones of his own story on purpose, did One Piece kind of lie to us? I need you to sit with that for a second, because on paper, it sounds awful. You track every promise in a series, discover most of them are broken, delayed, or inherited by someone else, and your pattern-seeking monkey brain goes, fraud, scam, narrative pyramid scheme. But listen to me. We need to separate two very different kinds of lying before we start throwing the word dishonest at a 25-year marathon of storytelling. There are narrative lies and there are authorial lies. Narrative lies are inside the world. Characters make hopeful vows they can't possibly keep. Villains make deals they never intend to honor. Kids in East Blue swear they'll become the world's greatest swordsman and then promptly fall down some stairs. This is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal. It's misdirection. It's unreliable people. It's the emotional fog the story is intentionally using to show you how harsh this world actually is. Authorial lies are different. Authorial lies are when the author breaks the core contract with you. When the themes say friendship conquers all, and then in the final chapter, friendship is a punchline. When the writing cheats, retcons the foundation, or tells you for 20 years that inherited will matters, and then shrugs and says, actually, bloodlines were the only thing that counted, sorry. That's the category we should be terrified of. Here's the thing. One Piece lies to its characters constantly. Kuina and Zoro's promise, shattered. Nami's promise to free Kokoyasi with her own hands, twisted and shared with Luffy. Ace's promise that he won't die, the most brutal narrative lie in the series. The world government promises safety and justice and delivers genocide and cover-ups. Inside the fiction, promises are broken all the time. But look at how the story talks to you. From East Blue onward, it is brutally, almost rudely honest about how painful and unfair this world is. When a promise breaks, the camera does not look away. The entire Marineford War is the slow-motion autopsy of a promise that cannot be kept. There is no authorial gotcha, no cheap foreshadowing bait and switch. There is only, this is what it costs to live in a world structured this way. Pattern interrupt. The real liar here might be you, or me, or, more fairly, the entire community. We walked in assuming promise equals guarantee. We heard, I'll never lose again, and mentally stamped it as a binding contract instead of a terrified child screaming into the void. That assumption is the problem, and Oda has been dismantling it since Chapter 1. So no, One Piece doesn't betray us by breaking promises. It invites us to grow up, to move from every vow must be fulfilled on screen, to some vows become scars, some become fuel, some get handed to the next generation. The story isn't lying, it's upgrading our understanding of what a promise even is. Which raises a harder question we're going to have to tackle next. If most promises aren't guarantees, then which ones in One Piece actually are? So where does that leave you, practically, as a person who still has to watch or read this thing week to week? Because once you see that most promises are not guarantees, you can't unsee it. And I need you to understand, that's not a bug in your enjoyment. That's the upgrade. Here's the thing. We just built a toolkit. 4 promise types: personal vows, big dreams, systemic lies, inherited will. 4 outcomes: kept, broken, twisted, inherited. That's it. That's the whole menu. Every I swear, every I'll definitely, every teary sunset oath is just a combination of those categories. The author is not improvising a new metaphysical contract every time. He's picking from a very small, very intentional set. So going forward, anytime a character opens their mouth and says, I promise, or I'll never lose again, you can pause. You can ask, is this a dream, a vow, a system talking, or a will being passed down? And then you ask, is Oda setting this up to be kept broken, twisted, or inherited? You're not a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast anymore. You're doing basic narrative math. On a reread, this gets stupidly fun. You start spotting inherited will setups hiding in plain sight. Kuina and Zoro's promise, that's not just a kid vow. It's a baton handoff. Nami and Belmare's orchard, that's a dream that has to be twisted by Arlong before it can be reclaimed. The world government's "We protect peace" speeches, systemic lies that are designed to be broken on screen so you feel the gap between propaganda and reality. And then you notice the quiet graveyard, all the side character vows that never come back. The villager who swears he'll rebuild his island and then just doesn't get panel time ever again. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is noise on purpose. It makes the world feel full of human promises that don't get narrative VIP treatment. So when Oda actually drags one back from the dead after 500 chapters, you feel how planned that was. It also means when a promise really is kept, you can appreciate the cost. Laboon waiting for Brook, kept but twisted through 50 years of suffering. Sanji's "I'll never starve anyone," kept but weaponized against him in Whole Cake. On a second read, those aren't just wholesome moments. They're structural payoffs in a story that has shown you 100 broken oaths first. And no, this doesn't mean you have to turn into a cynical promise cop, issuing citations every time Oda drops a side quest. This is normal. This is fine. Being aware of the categories doesn't kill the magic. It just lets you see the card slight while still enjoying the trick. What it really does is move you into a smaller, smugger in-group. You're not just a One Piece has crazy foreshadowing bro fan anymore. You're someone who actually understands how those promises are being deployed. So in the next section, we're going to push this one step further and talk about which remaining promises are structurally not allowed to fail. So here's where I hand the loaded gun to you. We've talked about categories. We've talked about structure. We've talked about how an author can intentionally pre-write a promise so it can only bend in certain directions. Now, I need you to do the annoying fun part. Pick one promise in One Piece that you are convinced will never be kept as originally stated, and tell me why. Not "I have a feeling." I want an argument. I want you to drag that promise into the comments and put it on trial. And yes, it can be huge or tiny. You can go for the jugular and say, Chopper curing all diseases? There is no shot. Because if Chopper literally solves illness, that's not just a character payoff, that's a full genre collapse. That's Oda walking into his own world building with a sledgehammer. Or you can go cosmic and say, the world will never be truly peaceful, because the entire theme of Inherited screams that conflict is a relay race, not a finish line. Either way, I want you to commit. Plant your flag. Be wrong with confidence. Here's the thing. We're not just throwing takes at the wall. We need to use the framework. When you drop your promise in the comments, label it. Is it broken, twisted, or inherited? Broken means the story has already structurally made it impossible. Twisted means it'll technically be fulfilled, but in a way that would make early arc you spit out your cereal. Inherited means the person who made the promise was never meant to be the one who keeps it. They were just the delivery system. So if you think Chopper's dream is doomed, is that because it's going to be twisted into he becomes the doctor who can treat any disease he encounters, but the world stays sick? Or inherited, where he becomes the mentor whose research some future Vegapunk Jr. uses to actually crack the code? If you think the promise of a peaceful world is a lie, is that a broken ideal? Or is it secretly an inherited one that skips straight over Luffy's generation into the kids we keep seeing in cover stories? Listen to me. This is not a sin. Being negative about a promise is not disrespecting the series. This is fine. This is normal. This is how you stop being a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast every time Oda draws a sun and start thinking about foreshadowing the way a writer has to. The point is not to be right. The point is to train your brain to ask, what category of payoff is even possible here, given everything that's already been planned? And I'm not just farming engagement. I'm archiving you. I'm going to screenshot the most interesting predictions and revisit them in a future video or community post once more of the Final Saga detonates. We're turning the comments section into a time capsule of this community's collective brain before the endgame finishes cooking. Because in the next section, we're going to stop asking which promises might fail in theory and start naming the ones the story almost certainly cannot allow to succeed. And one of them is probably your favourite. And one of them is probably your favourite. So if you're still here after all of that, congratulations, you have officially inherited my promise problem. You did this to yourself. I sat here building a spreadsheet of fictional vows, and you sat here watching me explain it, which means we are both in the same deranged category of fan who treats a shonen manga like a legal case file. Listen to me. Normal people do not spend 2 hours doing a promise autopsy on a rubber pirate. This is not normal behaviour. This is fine. This is our problem now. Here's the thing I need you to walk away with. One Piece is not a story where every promise is kept. If that's what you wanted, you'd read a wish fulfillment web novel where every childhood vow cashes out with a neat bow and a commemorative group photo. One Piece is a story about what survives when promises break, what gets inherited, what refuses to die even when the person who said the words is gone. Kuina's promise doesn't get kept. It mutates into Zoro's entire existence. Nolan's I'll come back rots into a legend and then quietly resurrects when Mont Blanc's descendant and the Straw Hats stumble into Skypiea. The world government keeps making these grand planned oaths of justice and peace, and the text just keeps showing you the bodies underneath. The difference between those and Luffy saying I'll be Pirate King is that his promise is less a contract and more a contagious disease. And now you're infected. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every new chapter, your brain is going to start tagging lines. Personal vow, inherited will, doomed oath, background noise. You're going to watch some random side characters swear they'll rebuild their island, and your first thought will be, is this a Laboon tier commitment, or is this Oda using broken promises as world-building texture? This is not a sin. This is just what happens when you mainline author intent and foreshadowing discourse for too long. We need to admit we enjoy this. We are pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast and thematic resonance in every panel of a kid raising his fist. And if you want more of that problem, I've got you. I've already done this exact brand of obsessive storytelling analysis on Oda's foreshadowing, on how deaths actually function in this series, on why the world building feels heavier than most serious fiction. Those are in the playlists. Go there next. Ruin the series for yourself in a deeper, more informed way. I can't promise I'll cover every future arc perfectly, or that I'll catch every single promise the first time. That would be a lie, and we've just spent an entire video roasting bad promises. What I can promise is that when I say Oda plans something, I'll bring receipts. I'll show you the panels, the interviews, the patterns, and we'll keep arguing about this story together until the last promise finally breaks or pays off. That's my promise problem. Now it's yours.